It was one of those typical Fridays in my 11th grade English class, the last period of the day, and a period everyone was more than ready to finish. Spring break was just around the corner, and the week had been dragging on forever. The tension in the air was almost tangible, like everyone was holding their breath, just waiting to be released for that long-anticipated week of freedom. Our English teacher, Ms. Walsh, seemed to sense the restlessness. She was one of those teachers who just knew how to read a room. So instead of pushing through with more essays and poetry discussions, she decided to let us wind down a bit. She told us we'd do something fun and interactive, letting us choose from a few options on an educational games website. In no time, we were huddled around her computer, challenging each other on a geography quiz, laughing over the absurd mistakes we made, and the way we all seemed to forget where places were on the map. The laughter lightened the room, and it felt good, almost like being at a friend's house instead of stuck in class. I remember the exact moment it all changed. Just as my friend Jamie managed to answer a particularly tough question about the capital of Peru, the sound of the principal's voice broke through the speakers with a harsh, abrupt crackle. Attention, teachers, this is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Initiate full lockdown immediately. Secure all doors and windows. Stay away from the windows and keep students quiet. Ms. Walsh's face, normally calm and reassuring, paled almost instantly. I could feel my heart beating faster. It didn't take long for her to click off the projector and move quickly to the door, her hands trembling slightly as she locked it. Without a word, she motioned us toward the corner of the room, where we huddled together, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The hum of the air conditioning went silent, and so did the buzzing of the fluorescent lights. They must have cut the power. My hands started to feel clammy, and I realized I was shaking just a little. The atmosphere in the room shifted. We weren't laughing or even whispering now, just sitting in eerie, unnatural silence. All I could hear was the shallow breathing of my classmates and the sound of my own heart thudding loudly in my chest. Minutes passed, maybe only 2 or 3, but they felt like hours. Then came the sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. They echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each step. My heart raced even faster. I glanced around at my classmates, who were equally wide-eyed and tense. No one dared to move. Suddenly, we heard a loud, guttural shout that echoed down the corridor. It was a man's voice, wild and angry, shouting something I couldn't quite make out. But the words didn't matter. The tone alone was enough to chill my bones. I caught a glimpse of Jamie, her face pale, her hands pressed tightly over her mouth, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She wasn't alone. 2 other girls in the corner had started to cry quietly, the silent tears streaming down their cheeks as they tried to keep from sobbing aloud. The footsteps grew louder, each one falling with a harsh, deliberate echo that made it sound like he was kicking the walls. I tried to press myself further into the corner, to make myself as small as possible. Ms. Walsh put a finger to her lips, her eyes pleading with us to stay silent. None of us needed the reminder. We barely dared to breathe. The noise grew louder as the man approached, his steps punctuated by furious shouts and the sound of fists slamming against lockers. He was cursing, screaming about something incomprehensible, and there was no mistaking the pure rage in his voice. It was primal, raw, and terrifying. I felt the hairs on my arms prickling as he drew closer, each slam of his fists seeming to rattle the walls. Finally, he reached our door. My heart sank, and I could feel my stomach twist as he banged on it, hard enough to shake the hinges. One of the girls couldn't help herself. She let out a tiny, terrified whimper. The man stopped for a second, as if he'd heard her, and I saw Ms. Walsh's face go white as she held a finger to her lips, her expression desperate. "Open up!" the man screamed, pounding his fists against the door so hard I thought it would shatter. He tried the handle, jerking it violently. The door didn't budge, and I thanked every higher power I could think of that Ms. Walsh had locked it. His voice grew louder, his fists slamming even harder, and I could feel the raw fear from everyone in the room. Jamie was clutching my arm, so tightly I could feel her fingernails digging into my skin. Ms. Walsh was watching the door with terrified eyes, her lips pressed tightly together. Every second felt like an hour. I kept imagining what would happen if he somehow forced his way in. I couldn't shake the thought, no matter how hard I tried. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped. We heard the sound of his footsteps again, moving away from our door, his voice still echoing down the hallway, still filled with rage and anger. I didn't dare to breathe until the sound had faded completely. We sat there, frozen, for what felt like hours. In reality, it was probably only minutes, but time had lost all meaning. Eventually, we heard the principal's voice again, a bit calmer this time, but still tense. He explained that a man had somehow entered the building and was causing a disturbance, and that all teachers were to remain in lockdown until the authorities arrived. He reassured us that staff had locked down all doors and were trying to contain the situation, but I could tell from his tone that he was just as afraid as we were. We stayed huddled in the corner for what felt like an eternity, waiting in tense, oppressive silence. Occasionally, we heard distant shouts, but they grew less frequent over time. At one point, I thought I heard the sound of sirens outside the school. Finally, the principal came back on the loudspeaker, his voice calmer now. He explained that the authorities had arrived, and they were going to escort students out of the building in small groups. We were instructed to follow any police officer's directions carefully and to leave as quietly as possible. Ms. Walsh led us single file to the door, and I could see that she was still shaking. The hallways were eerily silent, and for the first time, I noticed the way the usual hum of the school, the constant noise of footsteps, chatter, and laughter, was absent, replaced only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional murmur from the police officers lining the hall. As we exited the building, I saw police cars and an ambulance parked outside, their lights flashing brightly in the dim evening light. Students and teachers stood in small clusters, whispering to each other with nervous glances, while parents hurried over to embrace their kids, some of them in tears. In the following days, we learned more about what had happened. The man, apparently someone who'd been dealing with serious mental health issues, had managed to enter the school through an unlocked side door. He had been ranting about a variety of things, none of them making much sense, before he started wandering the hallways, banging on doors and screaming at students and teachers alike. Fortunately, he hadn't harmed anyone, but the fear he'd caused left its own tensing up, ready to relive that moment. I don't know if they ever found the man, or if he got the help he clearly needed. Maybe he was out there somewhere, still struggling, still lost. Or maybe he was finally receiving the care that could keep him, and others, safe. All I know is that day changed something in me, something deep, something that has stayed with me ever since. At my school, lunch is split into 2 periods. First lunch is for 6th graders and half of the 7th graders, while the second lunch is for the rest of the 7th graders and all of the 8th graders. It was early November, and the days were already feeling shorter, darker, and colder. That particular day was one of those gloomy, gray ones where the clouds seemed to press down low, casting everything in shadows. My friends and I were in the cafeteria during first lunch, trying to make each other laugh over a few embarrassing moments from class the day before. Just as my friend Lily started telling us about her weekend plans, we heard a loud, booming sound from somewhere outside. It was the kind of sound that made everyone freeze, unsure whether it was thunder, construction, or something else. A few seconds later, we heard it again, 2 sharp, echoing booms that made everyone look around, eyes wide with confusion and worry. I figured it was just thunder. It definitely looked like rain was on the way. But then a 3rd and 4th boom followed, and this time, the cafeteria went dead silent. Almost immediately, chaos broke out. A few students started screaming, and suddenly, everyone was moving, some rushing toward the exits, others ducking down instinctively. I could feel my own heart hammering in my chest, and for a split second, I was frozen, unsure whether to laugh at everyone for overreacting or to start running with them. That's when campus security rushed in. The look on their faces told us everything we needed to know. This was no drill, and it definitely wasn't thunder. One of the security guards, a tall, broad-shouldered guy named Officer Tim, held up his hands, shouting for everyone to quiet down. Listen up. This is a lockdown. Everyone needs to move immediately to the gym and stay calm. Stay in line, and don't leave your friends behind. Now go." The cafeteria burst into frantic movement as everyone scrambled to follow his instructions. Students who had been in line for lunch dropped their trays and drinks, leaving behind everything they'd been carrying. My friends and I stayed close together, following the mass of students toward the gym. I noticed that even the teachers looked anxious, glancing around as if they were unsure what to expect. When we entered the gym, I saw that the teachers and security staff were already covering the windows with blackout curtains, making sure no one could see in or out. The gym was enormous, a huge open space lined with rows of bleachers and high windows that usually let in a lot of light. But now, it felt like we were being shut inside, cut off from the world outside. Teachers were positioned at every exit, their faces tense and watchful. My friend Josh was fidgeting next to me, his eyes darting around the room. "What do you think is going on?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the murmurs and whispers of our classmates. "No idea," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe it's a drill?" He shook his head. "It doesn't feel like a drill." Just then, I spotted Officer Tim talking with one of the other security guards near the door. He looked serious, his eyes scanning the room as if he was counting heads. Josh, being braver than I was, decided to go over and see if he could find out what was happening. I watched as he approached one of the teachers and asked a few questions. After a moment, he came back, his face pale. "You know the houses across from the main entrance?" he said, his voice low. "Yeah," I replied, frowning. "Why?" "There's a guy barricaded inside one of them. Apparently, he's got weapons, and he's threatening to hurt himself and anyone who tries to get near him. The police are there now, but they're worried he might have a gun. That's why they're keeping us locked down." I felt a chill run down my spine. The thought of someone like that being so close to our school was unsettling. I glanced at my other friends, who were listening in, and I could see the fear in their eyes. No one said a word. We just sat there, tense and silent, as the minutes dragged by. The gym grew quieter as more students settled in, most of them huddled together in small groups, whispering nervously. I could feel the tension in the air. Everyone was on edge, glancing toward the doors and windows as if they expected something to happen at any moment. After a while, my friend Emily leaned over and said, "Do you guys remember that guy I told you about? The one my mom saw on Halloween?" "Yeah. Didn't she say he was acting weird?" Josh asked, looking at her intently. Emily nodded, her face serious. She saw him at his window, writing on the glass with something red. She thought it was just paint or fake blood, like for Halloween. But now, I don't know. She said he looked kind of unhinged, muttering to himself and pacing back and forth. She didn't think much of it at the time, but now I'm wondering if it was the same guy. I shivered, feeling a wave of unease wash over me. The idea that someone so unstable was living just across the street from us, watching us, was more than a little terrifying. As the minutes ticked by, the gym grew colder and more uncomfortable. Kids were starting to shift restlessly, whispering nervously to each other. Some of the younger students looked like they were on the verge of tears, and a few were already crying softly, their friends trying to comfort them. I could feel my own anxiety building, a tight knot forming in my stomach. After what felt like an eternity, one of the administrators finally stepped into the gym. She looked calm, but there was a tension in her eyes that betrayed her worry. She held up her hands for silence, and the gym gradually quieted down. "Thank you all for your patience," she said, her voice steady but a little strained. "The situation outside is under control, and the authorities are handling it. We're going to begin escorting students back to their classrooms one group at a time. Please stay with your teachers and follow their instructions carefully. We want to make sure everyone gets back safely." The relief in the room was palpable. You could almost feel the tension start to lift as the teachers began organizing us into rows, ready to lead us back to our classes. As my group was led out of the gym, I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering fear. Part of me wanted to forget the whole thing, but another part couldn't shake the thought of that man in the house across the street. Back in class, everyone was buzzing with whispered conversations, trying to piece together what had happened. I overheard snippets of rumors. Some kids were saying he'd been watching the school for weeks. Others claimed he'd threatened to come onto campus. No one knew what was true, but the fear and uncertainty lingered. After school, I learned a little more. The man had apparently been dealing with severe mental health issues for years, and his behavior had only gotten worse recently. According to a neighbor, he'd been seen talking to himself, muttering about people who were out to get him, and writing strange messages on his windows. The police had been called several times before, but nothing had ever been done. This time, though, he had barricaded himself inside his house, and when officers tried to approach, he'd threatened them, shouting that he would hurt anyone who came near him. It turned out he lived right next to my friend Brandy, who shared even more disturbing details. She told me that he'd once come out on Halloween, standing at his window with a kitchen knife, cutting his arm and smearing the blood on the glass. Brandy had thought it was just a creepy Halloween prank, but now it was clear that he was much more unstable than anyone had realized. And I'd feel a slight twinge of fear, wondering if he was watching us, if he might come back. It took a long time for that feeling to fade, and even now, whenever I hear a loud noise or see a flash of movement from those windows, I can't help but remember that day. The day we realized that the things we fear aren't always as far away as we'd like to believe. The IT department at Riverside High School wasn't exactly what most people would picture when thinking of a school's tech hub. Instead of the sleek, modern setup you might expect, it was tucked away in the basement of the aging building, past the boiler room and storage areas filled with dusty theater props and forgotten sports equipment. But our little corner of that basement? That was different. I'd only been working there for 3 months, fresh out of college with my IT degree, but I'd already grown fond of our cozy 3-person office. It was an oasis in the otherwise cluttered basement. 3 spacious desks, modern computers, even a wall-mounted TV that we'd sometimes use for testing the school streaming system or catching a game during lunch breaks, though we'd never admit that to administration. The best part was the industrial-grade air conditioning unit that kept our sensitive equipment cool, a luxury that made us the envy of the teachers stuck in their stuffy classrooms above. I owed this job to Mr. Harrison, Mrs. Chen, and Mr. Roberts, my former computer science teachers who had become mentors and friends over the years. They'd seen potential in me during high school, letting me help troubleshoot lab issues and even assist in teaching younger students. When the IT position opened up, they'd advocated strongly for me despite my limited experience. Technical skills can be taught, Mr. Harrison had told the principal, but finding someone who truly understands our school community, that's rare. My coworkers, Tom and Marcus, were easy to get along with. Both in their 40s, they'd been managing the school's technology infrastructure for over a decade. They had an efficient system worked out. Marcus handled networking and security, Tom managed the administrative systems, and I was learning both while taking on the endless stream of help desk requests from teachers and staff. Everything was going smoothly until that Wednesday in October. The morning had started normally enough. I'd spent it setting up new Chromebooks for the freshman class while Tom and Marcus were upstairs dealing with some issues in the administration office. I just sat down to eat my lunch, turkey sandwich, apple, and those addictive salt and vinegar chips I couldn't seem to quit when my phone buzzed with an alert from the school's emergency system. Lockdown protocol initiated. This is not a drill. Secure your location immediately. My heart started racing. We'd had lockdown drills before, but that this is not a drill message made my blood run cold. I quickly dimmed my computer screens and turned off the lights in our office space. That's when I realized just how vulnerable our location was. Our office didn't even have a proper door, just an open archway. The basement door at the top of the stairs had a lock, but it had been broken for months, another item on the endless maintenance backlog. I tried calling Tom and Marcus, but got no answer from either of them. My hands were shaking as I typed out text messages. Are you guys okay? What's happening upstairs? No response. Minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. In the darkness, every small sound seemed amplified. The hum of the servers, the clicking of the air conditioning unit, my own breathing. I huddled under my desk, trying to make myself as small as possible while keeping my phone's brightness at its lowest setting. The basement's thick concrete walls meant I couldn't hear anything from the floors above. The not knowing was almost worse than anything else. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I heard it, the distinct creak of the basement door opening. My heart nearly stopped. Footsteps on the stairs, trying to be quiet but echoing in the empty space. They weren't the familiar footsteps of Tom or Marcus. I learned to recognize those over the past months. These were different, hesitant, but purposeful. I held my breath as the footsteps grew closer to our office. Should I call out? What if it was just a teacher looking for shelter? What if it wasn't? The footsteps entered our office space. In the dim light filtering down the stairwell, I could make out a pair of boots stopping near my desk. My phone chose that exact moment to vibrate with an incoming message, the sound seemingly as loud as a gunshot in the quiet space. The boots turned toward my desk. I made a split-second decision and spoke in a whisper. "Hello? I'm the IT staff." "Oh, thank God," a male voice whispered back. I was looking for somewhere to hide. "I'm here for a parent-teacher conference, and they told everyone to find shelter immediately." He crouched down near my desk, and I could see him better now. Middle-aged man in khakis and a blue button-down shirt, slightly out of breath. "I'm James," he said, extending his hand. "They didn't tell us what's happening upstairs. Do you know?" Before I could answer, my phone lit up with a message from Tom. "Don't trust anyone coming down there. Suspect is male, 40s, business casual, claiming to be a parent. Armed. Shot fired in main office. Police en route." The man, James, must have seen the color drain from my face. His expression changed subtly, hardening. His hand moved toward his waist. What happened next was pure instinct. I shoved my rolling chair at him with all my strength, sending him stumbling backward. I bolted for the server racks, ducking behind them just as the first shot rang out. The sound was deafening in the confined space, leaving my ears ringing. I crawled through the maze of cables and equipment, thankful for all the times I'd had to navigate this space to check connections. I could hear him moving, searching, but he didn't know the layout like I did. I made it to the old coal chute, a remnant from the building's earlier days that we used as a cable run to the upper floors. It was a tight fit, but fear gave me motivation. As I squeezed through the shaft, another shot rang out, the bullet sparking off metal somewhere below me. I emerged in a first-floor utility closet just as the first police officers were entering the building. They took him into custody as he tried to exit the basement stairs, his weapon still in hand. The full story came out later. James Wheeler had been fired from his job as a school security guard the previous year after several concerning incidents. He blamed the administration, particularly the head of security, for ruining his life. He'd come back seeking revenge, using his knowledge of the building to his advantage. If he hadn't run into me in the basement, he might have evaded capture much longer. The school installed proper doors and security systems in the basement after that. Our cozy little office got a solid door with a keypad lock, but it was months before I could eat lunch down there without jumping at every sound, before the darkness felt comfortable rather than threatening. Tom and Marcus started keeping a mini fridge stocked with my favorite salt and vinegar chips. "Combat pay," they joked, but I knew it was their way of showing they were glad I'd made it through that day. Mr. Harrison, Mrs. Chun, and Mr. Roberts stopped by more often, usually with coffee and conversations that carefully avoided discussing that Wednesday. A year later, I'm still here, still managing the school's technology from our basement office. The new security measures make it feel less like the cozy space it once was, but also safer. The incident changed me, made me more cautious, more aware. But it also showed me something about myself I never knew. When pushed to the limit, I could think clearly, act decisively. Sometimes, late in the afternoon when the building is quiet, I can still hear the echoes of those footsteps on the stairs. But now they remind me not just of fear, but of survival. Of the day I learned that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about acting despite your fear. The school installed a proper security system after that, with cameras covering every angle of the basement and stairwell. The footage is monitored 24/7, and all doors now have working locks and electronic access controls. Sometimes I miss the casual openness of our old setup, but then I remember that day, and I'm grateful for the changes. Tom and Marcus still joke about how I leveled up from IT support to action hero that day, but we all know how close it came to ending differently. The police later found a list in Wheeler's car, names of administration staff he planned to target. I wasn't on that list. I was just an obstacle he hadn't planned for, a random variable in what he thought would be a straightforward plan. That's the thing about working in IT. You get used to dealing with unexpected problems, finding solutions on the fly. Usually, those problems involve malfunctioning printers or forgotten passwords. But that day, those problem-solving skills saved my life. Now, whenever new staff complain about our strict security protocols or the multiple layers of access control, I just smile and help them through the process. Some inconveniences are worth the peace of mind they bring. The school counselor suggested I might want to find a different job, one with less traumatic associations. But this is where I belong. This basement, with its humming servers and temperamental air conditioning, is still my place. The incident changed how I see it, but it didn't change how I feel about the work or the school community. Every morning, as I descend those stairs into the basement, I remember not just the fear and the chaos, but also the strength I found in myself that day. The basement is different now, better lit, more secure, properly monitored. But more importantly, I'm different, stronger, more aware, more appreciative of the quiet moments and the simple pleasure of feeling safe. They say that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I don't know if that's always true, but I do know that surviving that day taught me something valuable about myself and about life. Sometimes the scariest moments show us what we're truly capable of. Sometimes the darkest places can lead us to our brightest realizations. Now, when new IT staff join our team, part of their orientation includes security protocols and emergency procedures. I'm always the one who conducts this training. I tell them my story, not to frighten them, but to emphasize why we take security so seriously. Every locked door, every security camera, every access code exists for a reason. In a school, we're not just protecting equipment, we're protecting people. The incident changed the way the whole school approaches security. What was once seen as an inconvenience is now understood as a necessity. Teachers who used to prop open doors for convenience now make sure they're properly secured. Students who once complained about having to wear ID badges now understand their importance. Sometimes it takes a crisis to create lasting change. But life goes on. The basement is still where I spend my days, troubleshooting network issues, updating systems, and helping teachers with their tech problems. The servers still hum, the air conditioning still keeps us cool, and yes, we still occasionally catch a game on that wall-mounted TV during lunch breaks. Some things change, some stay the same, and that's exactly as it should be, because that's what resilience really means. Not that you're unchanged by your experiences, but that you find a way to incorporate them into who you are and keep moving forward. Every day I walk down those stairs is a small victory, a reminder that fear didn't win. And in the end, that's what matters most. And that's it for today's stories. Each one a chilling reminder of how quickly a normal day can take a frightening turn. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more suspenseful stories, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there. I never thought a simple summer photography class would lead to the most haunting experience of my life. But looking back now, 15 years later, I can trace everything back to that humid June morning when I first met Ilari-chan. I was 16, desperately trying to find my place in the world. Photography seemed like a safe bet. Hide behind the lens instead of facing people directly. The community center offered a 6-week course, and my parents were happy to see me doing something other than playing video games in my basement. There were 12 of us in the class, but Ilari stood out immediately. She had this intense way of looking at things, like she was trying to memorize every detail of whatever caught her attention. While the rest of us fumbled with our cameras, she handled her old Polaroid with practiced ease. Her photos were different too. They had this unsettling quality that our instructor, Mr. Barrett, called provocative. We became friends, sort of. The kind of friendship that exists in the spaces between other relationships. Neither of us had many close friends, so we gravitated toward each other during class breaks and photo walks. Ilari would tell me about her theories on capturing true moments, those split seconds when people weren't aware they were being watched. That's when you see who they really are, she'd say, her dark eyes focused on something in the distance. When the masks come off. About 3 weeks into the course, Ilari invited me to help her with a special project. She said she needed an assistant to document life in transition around our small town. I agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because I had nothing better to do. We started meeting after class, wandering through neighborhoods with our cameras. Eilary insisted on using her Polaroid exclusively, saying digital cameras stripped away the soul of an image. She had this old messenger bag that she kept her growing collection in, carefully organized in manila envelopes. The first sign that something was off came when I noticed she was taking photos of the same house repeatedly. It was a modest two-story colonial with blue shutters on Maple Street. When I asked her about it, she just shrugged and said she was tracking the changes. Then I started noticing other patterns. She had multiple photos of certain people: a red-haired woman who jogged every morning, an elderly man who walked his German Shepherd, a teenage boy who delivered newspapers. Always candid shots, always when they weren't looking. It's like a study, she explained when I finally worked up the courage to ask. Everyone has patterns, routines. If you watch long enough, you can predict exactly where they'll be, what they'll do. It's fascinating. The way she said fascinating made my skin crawl. One afternoon, while Eilary was busy photographing a mother and child at the playground, I snuck a peek inside her messenger bag. The manila envelopes were labeled with names and dates. Inside each one were dozens of Polaroids, arranged chronologically, some spanning weeks, others months. But it was the notes on the backs of the photos that really disturbed me. Detailed observations about daily schedules, habits, relationships, who visited these people, when they left for work, what time they turned their lights off at night. Eilary wasn't just documenting, she was surveilling. I found an envelope with my name on it. My hands trembled as I opened it. The photos started from before our class began. Me walking to school, sitting in my backyard, getting into my mom's car. All moments I never knew were being captured. The notes were even more chilling. Show signs of isolation, easily manipulated. Perfect subject for next phase. I carefully put everything back and made an excuse to leave early. That night, I could barely sleep. I kept thinking about all those people, unknowingly starring in Eilary's twisted photo collection. But what did she mean by next phase? The next day, I didn't go to class. Or the day after. My mom was surprised. I'd been so enthusiastic about the course before. I made up excuses about not feeling well. Then the Polaroids started showing up in our mailbox. One each day, showing me in various moments from the previous 24 hours. On the back of each one, a single word: missing you. I finally told my parents everything. They were horrified and immediately called the police. When the officers searched Eilary's house, they found an entire room dedicated to her project. The walls were covered with Polaroids, hundreds of them, connected by red string like some detective's evidence board. But Eilary was gone. The investigation revealed disturbing details. Eilary Chin wasn't even her real name. The family that everyone thought was hers? Paid actors, hired to help establish her cover story. The police found evidence linking her to similar projects in 3 other states. Most unsettling were the items missing from some of the homes she'd photographed. Small things the owners hadn't even noticed. A coffee mug, a hairbrush, a child's toy. Trophies, the police called them. They never found her. The case went cold after a few months. Life slowly returned to normal, or something close to it. I gave up photography and spent my remaining high school years trying to convince myself that I was safe, that it was all over. Until last week, I was going through some old boxes in my parents' attic when I found a manila envelope I didn't recognize. Inside was a single Polaroid, obviously recent, showing me packing boxes in my new apartment, the one I'd moved into just 2 months ago. On the back, in familiar handwriting, ready for the next phase? Below that was a USB drive. I should have turned it over to the police immediately, but curiosity, or maybe something darker, made me plug it in. It contained thousands of photos, spanning the 15 years since Eilary disappeared. Photos of me graduating high school, going to college, at my first job, on dates, at my wedding. Every major moment of my life, and countless small ones in between, all captured without my knowledge. But it was the last folder that made my blood run cold. It was labeled, The Others, and contained photos of everyone else from that summer photography class. All of us, documented through the years, our lives caught in Eilary's lens without our knowledge. We weren't just subjects. We were her collection. The most recent photo in my folder was taken yesterday. I'm sitting at my desk, writing this very story. The note on the back reads, "Telling tales? Don't worry. Soon everyone will understand our art." I'm writing this as a warning, but also as a confession. Because the truth is, ever since finding that USB drive, I've caught myself looking at people differently, noticing their patterns, thinking about how easy it would be to document their lives without them knowing. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the world through Eileri's lens. And sometimes, this is the part that terrifies me most. I understand exactly what she meant about capturing true moments. Last night, I bought a Polaroid camera. I tell myself it's for protection, that I need to document everything in case she's planning something. But deep down, I wonder if this is what she wanted all along. To make me see the world the way she does. To turn me into someone like her. The camera sits on my desk as I write this, its lens like an unblinking eye. Next to it is a manila envelope, still empty, waiting to be filled. And somewhere out there, Eileri is watching, her shutter clicking, capturing this moment for her collection. I know she's waiting for me to take that first photo, to start my own collection, to complete the transformation she began 15 years ago. The scariest part? I'm starting to think I want to. This morning, I found a note in my mailbox. No photo this time, just 5 words that made my heart stop. Your turn to teach someone else. Attached was a list of names. The students enrolled in next month's photography course at the community center. The Polaroid feels heavy in my hands as I write this. Outside, the sun is setting, casting long shadows that seem perfect for capturing those true moments Eileri always talked about. I should throw the camera away, call the police, warn those students. Instead, I'm checking the battery and loading film. Because now I understand what Eileri meant about masks, about seeing people as they really are. And once you start seeing the world this way, through the predator's lens, you can never go back to being prey. So if you're reading this, and you notice someone watching you, someone with a camera always ready, remember, not all collections are meant to be found. Some are meant to grow. Click. Growing up in a family of competitive gamers wasn't always easy, but it had its perks. While other families spent their holidays at beach resorts or theme parks, the Blackwood clan had a different tradition, the annual tournament. Every year, during the week between Christmas and New Year's, all 37 members of my extended family would gather at a different location for what could only be described as the most intense gaming competition you've ever seen. This year was special. I had just turned 21, which meant I could finally participate in the nighttime events. Up until now, I'd been relegated to the daytime competitions, chess tournaments, video game marathons, and elaborate scavenger hunts. But the night games? Those were legendary among the younger cousins. We'd hear stories about them for years, but the adults kept the details surprisingly vague. The location this year was a sprawling estate in northern Maine, a Victorian mansion surrounded by acres of dense forest. The property belonged to some tech millionaire who rented it out during the winter months. My uncle Jerome, who organized this year's event, had spent months preparing everything. Listen up, everyone. Jerome's voice boomed through the mansion's grand hall on the night of December 29th. All the adult family members, myself included, gathered around him. The younger cousins had already been sent to bed, supervised by our eldest Aunt Martha, who had retired from the competitions years ago. Jerome pulled out what looked like a modified paintball mask with various electronic attachments. This year's night game is called Digital Hunt. Each of you will wear one of these masks, equipped with augmented reality displays and motion sensors. Your objective is to collect digital tokens scattered throughout the forest while avoiding being tagged by other players. He went on to explain the rules. The masks would display a map showing token locations and other players within a 50-meter radius. Each player started with 3 lives. Getting tagged meant losing a life, and losing all 3 meant elimination. The last person standing, or the player with the most tokens at 3 a.m., would win the grand prize, a vintage gaming console collection worth thousands of dollars. One more thing, Jerome added, his expression turning serious. The forest is large, and it's easy to get lost. Each mask has a panic button. Press it 3 times quickly, and it will alert everyone to your location. Use it only in emergencies. As we suited up, I noticed my cousin Sarah looking nervous. She was 2 years older than me, but had always been the cautious type. "First time?" I asked, helping her adjust her mask. "Yeah," she replied. "I qualified last year, but chickened out. Something about running around in the woods at night just feels wrong." I understood her concern, but the excitement coursing through my veins overshadowed any apprehension. The masks were surprisingly comfortable, and the augmented reality display was crystal clear, showing a detailed map of the surrounding area with glowing dots representing tokens. At exactly midnight, Jerome fired a flare into the sky, and the game began. Most players immediately rushed into the forest, but I held back, watching their movements on my display. The smart play, I figured, was to let them thin each other out while I collected tokens from the periphery. The first hour went smoothly. I managed to collect 6 tokens while avoiding any confrontation. The night was clear but cold, and the snow crunched beneath my boots as I moved from tree to tree. The forest was eerily beautiful at night, with moonlight filtering through the bare branches and creating intricate shadows on the snow. Around 1 a.m., I noticed something odd. My display showed a player moving in a strange pattern, zigzagging through the trees about 40 meters to my left. They weren't heading toward any tokens, and their movement seemed erratic. Curious, I decided to investigate, keeping to the shadows of the larger trees. As I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't wearing one of our masks. Instead, they wore what looked like night vision goggles and carried some sort of device. My heart rate spiked. This wasn't part of the game. I quickly backed away, but my foot caught on a hidden root, causing me to stumble. The figure's head snapped in my direction. For a moment, we both stood frozen. Then they started moving toward me with deliberate speed. I turned and ran, no longer caring about stealth. My display showed 3 other players nearby, and I headed in their direction. Behind me, I could hear the crunch of snow getting closer. The stranger was fast, much faster than someone should be able to move through a dark forest. Suddenly, my display flickered and went dark. The mask's electronics had failed completely. Panicked, I ripped it off and continued running blindly through the trees. The moonlight was now my only guide, and shadows seemed to move and twist around me. A branch whipped across my face, drawing blood, but I didn't slow down. I could hear multiple sets of footsteps now, coming from different directions. My lungs burned from the cold air, and my legs felt like lead, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I burst into a small clearing and nearly collided with my cousin Derek. He had his mask off and was looking around wildly. "They're not part of the game," he gasped. "There's at least 4 of them." Before I could respond, a high-pitched tone pierced the night, causing both of us to cover our ears. My vision blurred, and I felt dizzy. Through watering eyes, I saw dark figures emerging from the trees around us. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, almost gliding over the snow. "Run!" Derek shouted, shoving me toward the gap between 2 of the figures. I sprinted through, hearing him close behind me. The strange tone continued, seeming to come from everywhere at once. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The mansion's lights appeared through the trees, and I could hear voices calling out. Jerome and several others were standing on the back patio, armed with actual rifles. Our family's enthusiasm for gaming was only matched by their love of firearms. As we reached the edge of the forest, the tones suddenly stopped. Jerome and my father rushed forward to meet us, guns raised toward the trees. Other family members were emerging from different directions, many without their masks, all looking terrified. "Inside now," Jerome ordered, firing several shots into the air. No one argued. We hurried into the mansion, and Jerome immediately initiated a head count. 3 people were missing: Sarah, my Uncle Marcus, and Cousin Pete. Just as Jerome was organizing search parties, we heard screaming from outside. Sarah burst through the door, half carrying, half dragging Pete. Both were covered in snow and shaking uncontrollably. Marcus followed a moment later, clutching his arm, which had a deep gash running from elbow to wrist. "There's more of them in the forest," Marcus gasped. "They've got some kind of technology I've never seen before. They were studying us." like we were some kind of experiment. Jerome immediately called the police, but by the time they arrived 2 hours later, there was no sign of the intruders. The only evidence we found were strange geometric patterns carved into several trees, and all of our masks had been seemingly fried by whatever signal had generated that tone. The police investigation turned up nothing concrete. The property's security cameras had all failed during the exact hours of our game, and the few footprints we could find seemed to vanish at random points, as if their owners had simply disappeared. In the days that followed, family members reported strange experiences. Electronic devices malfunctioning, unexplained lights in the sky above their homes, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Jerome received an anonymous email containing only a series of binary numbers which, when decoded, spelled out, "Thank you for participating." The annual tournament tradition continued, but we never played night games again. Some family members drifted away, too traumatized by what had happened. Others became obsessed with finding explanations, diving deep into research about experimental technology and government programs. As for me, I still love gaming, but I stick to well-lit rooms and traditional consoles now. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear that high-pitched tone in my dreams, and I'll wake up with the unshakable feeling that somewhere in the dark, someone, or something, is still playing their own version of our game. But the strangest part? Last week, exactly 1 year after that night, every family member who participated received the same text message from an unknown number. Ready for round 2? I deleted the message immediately, but I couldn't help noticing that it was sent at exactly midnight, and my phone's display showed no signal at the time it was received. Some games, I've learned, are better left unplayed. I've always been more of a planner than a spontaneous person, which is why it surprised everyone when I agreed to Sarah's last-minute vacation idea. We had been dating for just over a year, and she constantly teased me about my need to have everything scheduled weeks in advance. But when she showed me the listing for an old lighthouse keeper's house on the Oregon coast, something about it just called to me. "Come on, James," she had said, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she scrolled through the photos on her laptop. "The place is available next week, and it's way under our budget. How often do you get to stay in a real lighthouse?" The property wasn't actually in the lighthouse itself, but rather in the keeper's house adjacent to it. The lighthouse had been automated decades ago, but the Victorian-style house had been lovingly maintained and converted into a vacation rental. The photos showed a cozy interior with period furniture, a wood-burning fireplace, and windows that offered panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean. I found myself nodding before I could even think it through. "Let's do it," I said, surprising both of us. Sarah immediately called our friends Mike and Rachel, a couple we often hung out with. They were both teachers like Sarah, which meant they had the same spring break free. Within an hour, the trip was booked, and I was already wondering if I had made a mistake by not researching the property more thoroughly. The drive up the coast was beautiful, though increasingly remote. We left Portland late Friday afternoon in Mike's SUV, watching as the suburbs gave way to dense forests and occasional glimpses of the ocean. The GPS signal became spotty as we wound our way along coastal roads, but the property owner's directions were detailed enough to get us there. The sun was setting by the time we turned onto the private road leading to the lighthouse. The gravel path wound through a thick grove of wind-bent pines before opening up to reveal our destination. The lighthouse stood tall against the darkening sky, its beam already rotating steadily above us. The keeper's house beside it was exactly as pictured. A two-story Victorian painted a faded white with dark blue trim. "This is incredible," Rachel said, pressing her face against the car window. "Look at that view." The house sat on a cliff overlooking the ocean, with nothing but water visible to the horizon. The closest town was about 20 miles back, and we hadn't passed another house for at least 5 miles. The isolation felt peaceful rather than threatening, at least initially. The property manager, Mrs. Henderson, was waiting for us on the wraparound porch. She was an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a weathered raincoat despite the clear weather. "You made good time," she said, though none of us had told her when we were leaving Portland. "I've got the house all ready for you. Just a few things to go over before I head back to town." She led us through the house, pointing out various features. The antique furnishings we weren't to touch, the temperamental heating system, the emergency landline since cell service was spotty at best. The house was beautiful in an old-fashioned way, with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and large windows in every room. Now, about the lighthouse, Mrs. Henderson said, her tone becoming more serious. It's still operational, of course, and while the lower level is included in your rental, the upper levels are strictly off-limits. The door to the tower will be locked, and I must insist you don't try to access it. For liability reasons, she added quickly. We all nodded, though I caught Mike and Sarah exchanging a disappointed look. I knew they had been hoping to climb to the top. One more thing, Mrs. Henderson said as she headed for the door. If you hear any unusual sounds at night, it's just the wind. These old houses make all sorts of noises, especially this close to the ocean. Nothing to worry about. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Before any of us could ask what she meant by unusual sounds, she was gone. Her car disappearing down the gravel road faster than seemed safe in the growing darkness. The first few hours were fantastic. We unpacked, chose our rooms. Sarah and I took the master bedroom with the ocean view, while Mike and Rachel took the slightly smaller room facing the lighthouse, and prepared dinner in the surprisingly well-equipped kitchen. We opened a bottle of wine and gathered in the living room, where Mike got a fire going in the old fireplace. This place is perfect, Sarah said, curled up next to me on the antique sofa. I can't believe we got it for such a good price, especially during spring break. Maybe because it's so remote, Rachel suggested. Most spring breakers probably want to be closer to civilization. Or maybe because it's haunted, Mike said with an exaggerated wink, taking another sip of wine. We all laughed, but there was something slightly forced about it. The house did have a certain atmosphere as night fell, not necessarily threatening, but definitely present. The rotating beam from the lighthouse created strange moving shadows through the windows, and the wind had picked up, making the old house creak and groan. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. Sarah and I had just gotten into bed when we heard it. A sound that definitely wasn't the wind. Did you hear that? Sarah whispered, gripping my arm. I nodded, sitting up to listen more carefully. It was a metallic scratching sound, like someone dragging something heavy across a metal surface. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the lighthouse. It's probably just the mechanism that rotates the light, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by what could only be described as a long, low moan. Sarah's fingernails dug into my arm. James, that's not machinery. We heard footsteps in the hallway. Mike and Rachel had obviously heard it too. I opened our bedroom door to find them standing there, both looking pale. You guys heard that, right? Mike asked. Before anyone could respond, there was a loud bang from downstairs, like something heavy falling over. Rachel let out a small scream. We should check it out, I said, though every instinct was telling me to grab Sarah and run for the car. The four of us crept downstairs, Mike holding his phone as a flashlight. The living room was exactly as we'd left it, but it felt different somehow, colder, despite the lingering warmth from the fireplace. The scratching sound came again, definitely from the direction of the lighthouse. Look, Sarah whispered, pointing to the window. Through the glass, we could see that the door to the lighthouse tower was open, swinging slightly in the wind. The same door Mrs. Henderson had assured us would be locked. Maybe the wind blew it open, Rachel suggested. But we all knew the door had been securely locked when we arrived. Mike, always the brave one, headed for the door that connected the house to the lighthouse. We should at least close it before the wind damages something. Mike, don't, Rachel pleaded, but he was already turning the handle. The connecting door opened into a small room at the base of the lighthouse. The spiral staircase leading up to the light room was barely visible in the beam from Mike's phone. The open door to the outside was causing a draft that made the air feel even colder than it was. Mike stepped into the lighthouse, and that's when everything went wrong. The connecting door slammed shut behind him with enough force to shake the walls. Rachel screamed and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. We could hear Mike shouting and pounding on the other side. Then the lights went out. Not just the house lights. The lighthouse beam went dark too, plunging everything into absolute darkness. Sarah fumbled for her phone, but like mine, It had no signal, and the flashlight function wasn't working. The scratching sound was all around us now, accompanied by what sounded like whispers in a language I couldn't understand. Rachel was still trying desperately to open the door while Mike's shouts became more panicked. Suddenly, his shouting stopped. "Mike!" Rachel called out, her voice breaking. "Mike, answer me!" The silence that followed was deafening. Then we heard footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps, coming down the spiral staircase inside the lighthouse. They didn't sound like Mike's. Sarah grabbed my hand. "We need to get out of here. Now." We ran for the front door, but the handle wouldn't turn. The windows wouldn't open either. It was as if everything had been sealed shut. We were trapped. The footsteps reached the bottom of the lighthouse stairs. Something started pushing against the connecting door, making it bend inward slightly with each thrust. Rachel backed away, tears streaming down her face. In desperation, I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife I could find. Sarah and Rachel huddled behind me as we faced the door, watching in horror as the wood began to splinter. Just as the door seemed about to give way, all the lights came back on, including the lighthouse beam. The pressure on the door stopped. The scratching sounds and whispers ceased. We heard a key turning in the front door. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway, looking unsurprised to find us terrified in the kitchen at 2 a.m. Behind her, looking dazed but unhurt, was Mike. "I thought I told you the lighthouse was off limits," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice stern but not unkind. What just happened?" Sarah managed to ask. Mrs. Henderson sighed. The original lighthouse keeper, Mr. Harrison, was very dedicated to his job. Some might say too dedicated. When they automated the lighthouse in 1963, he refused to leave. They found him at the top of the tower a week later. The official cause of death was exposure, but she trailed off. Every few years, someone tries to go into the tower at night. Mr. Harrison doesn't like that. He's very protective of his lighthouse. Mike was pale but composed. "I don't remember much after the door closed," he said. "Just a feeling of intense cold, and someone whispering that I needed to leave. Then I was outside with Mrs. Henderson." "You're lucky," Mrs. Henderson said. "Mr. Harrison was feeling generous tonight. He usually—" She stopped herself. "Well, never mind about that. I suggest you all get some sleep. In the house, not the lighthouse. Mr. Harrison won't bother you there." She left before we could ask any more questions. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. None of us went near the lighthouse door again. The rest of our stay was uneventful, though we couldn't help noticing that the lighthouse beam seemed to follow us whenever we were outside. We cut our trip short, leaving Sunday morning instead of staying through Monday as planned. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. A figure stood at the top of the lighthouse, just visible through the glass. It raised its hand in what might have been a wave, or might have been a warning. Mrs. Henderson never charged us for the shortened stay. When I checked the rental listing a week later, curious about whether she would mention the incident to future renters, the property was no longer available. The website showed only an error message. The lighthouse keeper's property is no longer accepting guests. Sometimes, late at night, I look up old news articles about the lighthouse. I found one from 1963 about the death of the keeper, Thomas Harrison. The article included a photo. The figure I saw waving from the tower looked exactly like him. Sarah and I are still together, and we still take vacations, but we stick to well-reviewed hotels now. Mike and Rachel got married last year, but they chose a mountain venue for their honeymoon. None of us have any interest in staying near a lighthouse again. As for Mrs. Henderson, I tried to find her a few months after our stay, wanting to ask her more about what happened that night. The historical society in the nearest town told me they'd never heard of her. According to their records, the lighthouse keeper's house has been abandoned since 1963. I don't know what really happened that night, or who Mrs. Henderson was, or why the lighthouse keeper's spirit remains so devoted to his post even decades after his death. But I do know that some places aren't meant for vacation rentals, and some properties have permanent residents who don't show up in the listings. If you're ever browsing vacation rentals and see an old lighthouse keeper's house available for an unusually low price, my advice would be to keep scrolling. Some deals are too good to be true, and some properties come with extra guests who aren't mentioned in the reviews. And if you do find yourself near an old lighthouse at night, pay attention to any warnings you receive, especially from elderly property managers who appear out of nowhere and disappear just as quickly. They might just be trying to save your life. Well, creepy companions, that was the last of our 3 terrifying tales for tonight. If you enjoyed these spine-chilling stories, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps keep the scary stories coming and keeps the dark forces at bay. And if you want to hear more creepy tales like these, make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. You never know when the next horrifying story might appear in your feed. Speaking of which, let me know in the comments which of tonight's 3 stories scared you the most. Was it the mysterious figures in the woods? The protective lighthouse keeper's spirit? Or perhaps the final revelation about the property manager who was never there? Hi everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you watched this video to help you fall asleep, so before you drift off, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, settle in, get cozy, and relax with me. Let's start. Sarah and I had always dreamed of owning a Victorian house. When we found the listing for 47 Maple Street, with its weathered gables and wraparound porch, it seemed too good to be true. The price was well within our budget, suspiciously so, looking back, and the realtor was eager to close the deal. Perhaps we should have questioned why such a magnificent property was priced so modestly, but love has a way of clouding judgment. The house stood at the end of a quiet street in a small New England town, its faded blue paint peeling like old memories ready to be shed. Towering oak trees flanked the property, their branches creating intricate shadows that danced across the lawn. The previous owners had left abruptly, we were told, due to a job relocation. Their furniture still occupied some rooms, covered in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. "It's perfect," Sarah whispered when we first walked through the creaking front door. Her eyes sparkled as she took in the original hardwood floors, the ornate crown molding, and the grand staircase that curved up to the second floor. I had to agree. It was everything we'd hoped for in our first home together. The moving process was straightforward enough. We spent the first few days painting walls, replacing light fixtures, and making the space our own. The house seemed to respond positively to our presence, as if awakening from a long slumber. The autumn sunlight streamed through the tall windows, warming the rooms and casting golden patterns on the walls. It was during our first week that we discovered the journal. Sarah was cleaning out the built-in bookshelf in the study when she found it wedged behind a loose panel. The leather-bound book was weathered, its pages yellow with age. Inside, dated entries spanning from 1987 to 1988 detailed the experiences of a previous owner, Elizabeth Chun. "Listen to this," Sarah said, perching on the window seat. "October 15th, 1987. The music box in the attic played again today. I know I didn't wind it. James says I'm imagining things, but I know what I heard. The melody is always the same, a lullaby I can't quite place." I shrugged it off as the imaginings of a previous owner, but Sarah became fascinated with Elizabeth's writings. She spent evenings poring over the journal, occasionally reading passages aloud that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Elizabeth wrote about cold spots that appeared and disappeared, about objects that moved on their own, and about dreams that felt more like memories of events she'd never experienced. The first incident we couldn't explain happened 3 weeks after we moved in. I was working late in the study, grading papers for my high school English class, when I heard piano music drifting up from the first floor. The notes were hesitant, like someone picking out a melody they half remembered. I assumed Sarah was playing on the old upright in the living room, though I didn't know she could play. When I went downstairs to investigate, the living room was empty. The piano stood silent, its yellowed keys untouched. Sarah was already in bed, reading. "I thought you were playing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up from her book, confused. "I don't play piano. You know that." We both heard the music after that, always late at night, always the same fragmentary melody. Sometimes it was accompanied by the sound of footsteps on the stairs, though we never saw anyone. Sarah began to document our experiences in her own journal, drawing parallels between what was happening to us and what Elizabeth had written about 30 years earlier. The dreams started next. They weren't nightmares exactly, but they left us both unsettled. In mine, I was always searching for something in the house. Opening doors, looking under furniture, checking behind walls. I never knew what I was looking for, but the sense of urgency was overwhelming. Sarah's dreams were more specific. She dreamed of a young woman in a blue dress, sitting at the piano, endlessly practicing the same piece of music. One morning, Sarah woke up crying. "She's so sad," she said when I asked what was wrong. "She's been waiting so long." "Who has?" "Emily, the girl in the blue dress." I hadn't told Sarah about my research, but I'd been digging into the house's history. There had been an Emily Sullivan, the daughter of the house's original owners. She died in 1912 at the age of 19. According to newspaper archives, she'd been a promising pianist who died under mysterious circumstances. The article mentioned that she was found at the piano. Sheet music for an unfinished composition spread before her. The activity in the house intensified after that. Objects would move when we weren't looking. We'd find all the doors open in the morning, though we'd closed them the night before. The piano music became louder, more insistent. Sometimes we'd hear what sounded like someone running up and down the stairs, their footsteps urgent and heavy. Sarah became convinced that Emily was trying to communicate with us. She started leaving sheet music on the piano, hoping to encourage some kind of interaction. I remained skeptical, but I couldn't deny that something strange was happening in our home. The turning point came on a cold November night. We'd been in the house for 2 months, and the activity had reached a fever pitch. The piano music had been playing for hours, louder than ever before. Sarah sat in the living room, watching the keys move on their own, while I paced nervously behind her. Suddenly, the music stopped. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and we could see our breath in the air. Sarah stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on a point near the piano. I couldn't see anything, but I felt a presence, something old and sad and desperate to be heard. "She wants to finish it," Sarah whispered. "The composition. She never got to finish it." What happened next defies explanation. Sarah walked to the piano and sat down. Though she'd never played before, her fingers found the keys with certainty. The melody that emerged was the same one we'd been hearing for weeks, but this time it continued past the point where it usually stopped. Sarah played for nearly an hour, her hands moving as if guided by an invisible force. When she finished, she was crying, but smiling. "It's done," she said simply. "She can rest now." The house felt different after that night. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the strange occurrences gradually ceased. We still hear the piano occasionally, but it's distant now, like an echo of a memory. The song Sarah played that night, Emily's final composition, was eventually published. Music scholars were fascinated by its complexity and emotional depth. We've lived in the house for 5 years now. We've made peace with its history and its mysteries. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, we sit in the living room and listen for echoes of the past. The house has taught us that not all hauntings are malevolent. Sometimes they're just unfinished stories, waiting for the right people to help tell them. Sarah still has Elizabeth Chin's journal, and she's added her own volumes to it. Sometimes new owners of old houses write to us, sharing their own inexplicable experiences. We tell them what we've learned, that history doesn't always rest quietly, that music can bridge the gap between past and present, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen to the stories our homes are trying to tell us. Last week, we found a note written in unfamiliar handwriting on the piano. "Thank you for listening." The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink was fresh. Sarah framed it and hung it above the piano. A reminder that some mysteries don't need to be solved to be understood. We've talked about moving. The house is getting a bit small now that we're expecting our first child, but something always holds us back. Maybe it's the thought of leaving Emily, though we sense she's at peace now. Or maybe it's because we've learned that home isn't just about the living space we create in the present. It's also about the echoes of all the lives that came before us, the stories embedded in the walls, and the music that lingers in the air long after the last note has faded away. Sometimes, late at night, I think I see a young woman in a blue dress sitting at the piano. She never plays anymore. She doesn't need to. Her story has been told, her music completed. But she stays, a gentle guardian of the house and its memories, reminding us that every home has its own symphony of stories, if only we take the time to listen.
I never wanted to take the night shift at Silver Pine Lodge. The pay was better, sure, but something about working alone in that massive old building, perched on the edge of the wilderness, always felt wrong. But bills needed paying, and beggars can't be choosers, especially not in a small town like Pine Haven where jobs were as scarce as sunshine in December. The lodge itself was beautiful during the day, a masterpiece of rustic architecture with its towering stone fireplace and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding forest. But at night, those same windows became like black mirrors, reflecting the dim interior lights and making it impossible to see what might be lurking in the darkness beyond. My job was simple enough: maintain the building's systems during the off-season winter months when the lodge was closed to guests, check the boilers, monitor the security cameras, and make sure nothing froze or broke. The owner, Mr. Harrison, was paranoid about pipes bursting or animals getting in, so he paid good money to keep someone on site every night from October through March. That particular night started like any other. I arrived just as the maintenance day shift was leaving, exchanging quick pleasantries with Mike, the daytime caretaker. He mentioned something about strange noises coming from the east wing, but we both brushed it off as the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling in the cold. "Probably just the wind," he said, zipping up his heavy winter coat. "But maybe check the windows in that section. Make sure nothing's loose." I nodded, already thinking about the long night ahead. 12 hours alone in a building big enough to house 200 guests, with nothing but the hum of heating systems and the occasional ping of radiators for company. I'd done it hundreds of times before, but something felt different that night. Maybe it was the way the wind howled through the trees, or how the snow seemed to fall in unusual patterns, swirling and dancing like it was being orchestrated by some unseen force. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I made my initial rounds, checking all the major systems and marking everything down in the logbook. The east wing was quiet, no unusual noises, though I did notice that one of the thermostats was reading slightly lower than it should have been. I adjusted it and made a note to have Mike check it in the morning. Around midnight, I settled into the security office with a cup of coffee and my tablet. The office was my favorite spot in the lodge, a small room near the main entrance with monitors showing feeds from all 36 security cameras. It made me feel less alone, being able to see every major area of the building at once. Plus, it was the warmest room, thanks to all the electronics. I was halfway through an article about urban legends in the area when I first noticed something odd on one of the monitors. Camera 12, which covered the main hallway of the east wing, showed a brief flicker of movement. It was so quick I almost missed it, just a shadow passing through the frame. I rewound the footage, but there was nothing there. Must have been a glitch in the system. But then it happened again, this time on camera 15, which monitored the grand staircase. Another shadow, moving too fast to be natural, like someone running past the camera at impossible speed. My heart started beating faster as I checked all the monitors more carefully. Everything looked normal, but something felt off. The air in the small office seemed heavier, colder, despite the warmth from the equipment. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, standard issue for all-night staff, and decided to do another round of checks. The hallways seemed longer than usual, the shadows deeper. My footsteps echoed off the wooden floors, each sound sending little jolts of anxiety through my spine. The east wing thermometer was now reading 10 degrees lower than it had been an hour ago, despite the heating system running at full capacity. As I stood there checking the thermostat, I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was like someone dragging something heavy across the floor, coming from one of the guest rooms down the hall. The sound stopped abruptly when I turned my head toward it. I stood perfectly still, listening, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. "Is someone there?" No response, just the usual ambient noises of the building. I keyed my radio, thinking about calling Mike or even local security, but what would I say? That I heard a noise? That I was spooked by shadows on security cameras? They'd laugh it off, tell me to grow up. Besides, I'd signed up for this job knowing I'd be alone. I decided to check the room where I'd heard the noise. It was standard procedure to investigate any unusual sounds. Usually it turned out to be a broken window letting in wind, or a small animal that had somehow found its way inside. Room 237 was dark and cold, much colder than it should have been. My flashlight beam revealed nothing out of the ordinary. A perfectly made bed, drawn curtains, the usual hotel room furniture all covered in white sheets for the off-season. But something caught my eye, a mark on the hardwood floor near the bathroom door. I moved closer, crouching down to examine it. It looked like a scratch, fresh and deep, as if something with considerable strength had dug into the wood. As I examined it, I noticed more scratches, forming a trail that led into the bathroom. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run back to the security office and call for help. But I had a job to do. If something was damaging the property, I needed to know what it was. I stood up, took a deep breath, and walked toward the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar. The bathroom was pitch black, my flashlight beam seeming to get swallowed by the darkness. As I pushed the door open wider, the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath now, forming little clouds in the beam of light. The mirror above the sink was completely fogged over, despite the bone-dry air. Then I saw it, or rather, I saw them. More scratches, dozens of them, covering the walls in chaotic patterns. They looked fresh, the exposed with still light in color where whatever had made them had torn through the wallpaper. Some of them formed shapes that looked almost like letters, but in no alphabet I'd ever seen. A sound behind me made me spin around, something between a whisper and a hiss, coming from back in the bedroom. My flashlight beam darted around, searching for the source, but found nothing. The door to the hallway was now closed, though I was certain I'd left it open. I reached for the door handle, trying to keep my hand steady. It was ice cold to the touch, and for a moment, I thought I saw something dark move across the fogged mirror in my peripheral vision. The handle wouldn't turn. I tried again, harder this time, but it was like it was frozen in place. The whispers grew louder, seeming to come from all around me now. My flashlight began to flicker, its beam growing weaker. In the failing light, I saw something start to appear in the fog on the mirror, lines being drawn by an invisible hand, forming what looked like a face, but wrong somehow, distorted and inhuman. The flashlight died completely. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard something move behind me, accompanied by a sound like dry leaves scratching against wood. The air grew even colder, and I felt something brush against my back. Something that felt like fingers, but too long, too cold to be human. Pure instinct took over. I slammed my shoulder into the door as hard as I could. Once, twice, 3 times until it finally burst open. I ran, not daring to look back, my feet somehow finding their way through the darkness. The whispers followed me, along with that horrible scratching sound, growing louder and faster. I made it back to the security office in record time, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone as I pulled it out to call Mike. But before I could dial, I glanced at the monitors and felt my heart stop. Every camera in the East Wing was showing the same thing, static and darkness, except for camera 12. There, in the grainy footage, I could clearly see a figure standing in the hallway, tall and impossibly thin, its body bent at unnatural angles. It was looking directly at the camera, and even through the poor quality of the video feed, I could see that its face was exactly like the one that had been drawn in the fog on the mirror. The figure raised one long-fingered hand and seemed to wave at the camera. Then, one by one, all the monitors went dark. The office lights flickered and died, leaving me in complete darkness. My phone screen went black, despite being fully charged moments ago. In the darkness, I heard the office door handle slowly begin to turn. I'd like to say I stayed to face whatever was trying to get in, but I didn't. I had a spare key to the maintenance exit in my pocket, and I used it. I ran out into the snowy night and didn't stop until I reached my car. The engine started on the first try, thank God for small mercies, and I sped away from Silver Pine Lodge as fast as I dared on the icy roads. I called Mike from the road, once my phone mysteriously started working again. He went to check the lodge with the police, but they found nothing out of the ordinary. No scratches on the floors or walls, no malfunctioning cameras, no signs of any disturbance at all. The temperature readings were all normal, and the security footage showed nothing unusual, just empty hallways and dark rooms. Mr. Harrison was surprisingly understanding when I quit the next day. In fact, he didn't seem shocked at all. He just nodded slowly and said something that still haunts me. It usually takes them longer to notice. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I drove past Silver Pine Lodge yesterday, during daylight hours. It looked perfectly normal, beautiful even, with fresh snow covering the grounds and smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney. But I noticed they're hiring again for the night shift position. The pay is even better now. Sometimes I wonder about the poor soul who took my place, alone in that building at night. I wonder if they've heard the whispers yet, or seen the shadows moving in the cameras. I wonder if they've noticed how the east wing grows colder as the night progresses, or how the mirrors fog over even when the air is dry. But mostly, I wonder about what Mr. Harrison meant by them, and how many others before me had seen what I saw in room 237. How many others had run from that thing with the distorted face and long, cold fingers. How many others had discovered that sometimes the most frightening things aren't the ghosts or monsters we imagine might be hiding in the darkness. Sometimes, the most frightening things are the ones that have always been there, patiently waiting in places we thought we knew, watching us through cameras we thought were keeping us safe, waiting for us to finally notice them. I still work night shifts now, but at a 24-hour diner in town. The pay isn't as good, and the hours are just as lonely, but at least here, the only things watching me through the windows are the occasional deer and maybe some late-night truckers looking for coffee. And if I sometimes think I see something tall and thin walking through the parking lot, or notice strange scratches appearing on the bathroom mirrors, well, I just turn up the radio and tell myself it's all in my head. But I keep my car keys close, just in case. And I never, ever look too long at the security cameras.
Being a subway train operator on the midnight shift wasn't everyone's cup of tea, but I had grown to appreciate the solitude. The pay was decent, and there was something oddly peaceful about guiding my train through the underground tunnels of the city while most people were asleep. At least, that's what I used to think before that night changed everything. I had been working the midnight to 8 a.m. shift on the Blue Line for almost 3 years. It was the least popular route, running through some of the oldest parts of the city's underground network. The tunnels there dated back to the 1920s, and it showed patches of original brickwork still visible between modern reinforcements, old maintenance walkways that hadn't been used in decades, and side tunnels that led to abandoned platforms from a bygone era. That night started like any other. I arrived at the depot just before midnight, went through the usual equipment checks, and started my first run. The Blue Line wasn't busy during regular hours, let alone at midnight, but the city maintained 24-hour service on all major lines. Most of my passengers were night shift workers, drunk partygoers, or the occasional tourist who had lost track of time. The first few runs were uneventful. Stop, open doors, wait, close doors, continue. The routine was almost meditative. Around 2 a.m., during what would normally be my quietest run, something felt different. The tunnels seemed darker somehow, the familiar shadows deeper and more absolute. The service lights that usually provided a dim glow along the tracks appeared fainter, creating strange patterns of darkness that my brain struggled to process. I had just left Chester Station, heading toward the longest stretch of tunnel on the route, a 2-mile section with no stops that curved deep under the old part of the city. The tunnel here was purely original construction, too narrow for modern safety walkways. Management had been promising to renovate it for years, but budget constraints kept pushing it back. My train was empty except for one passenger, an elderly woman sitting in the middle car. I had noticed her boarding at Chester Station, which was unusual because that station was in a business district, completely deserted at this hour. She had caught my attention because of her old-fashioned clothing, a long, dark dress that seemed more suited to a funeral than late-night travel. As the train entered the long tunnel section, the overhead lights in the cars began to flicker. This wasn't entirely unusual in the older sections of track, where power fluctuations sometimes occurred, but something about it made my skin crawl. Through the CCTV monitor that showed the passenger cars, I noticed the old woman hadn't moved or reacted to the flickering lights. She sat perfectly still, head bowed, hands folded in her lap. The radio crackled to life, making me jump. Instead of the usual clear transmission, I heard only static, punctuated by what sounded like distant voices speaking words I couldn't quite make out. I checked my signal indicator. It showed full strength, which was impossible in this section of tunnel. We were too deep underground. The flickering in the passenger cars grew worse, and now I could see that the old woman had raised her head. Through the grainy CCTV feed, it looked like she was staring directly at the camera. Something about her face seemed wrong, but the poor quality of the image made it hard to tell exactly what. Then the train's wheels hit something on the track, at least, that's what it felt like. The entire train shuddered, and for a moment, the lights went out completely. When they came back on a second later, the CCTV monitor showed the old woman was gone. My heart started racing. People couldn't just disappear from a moving train. I grabbed the radio to call control, but now it was completely dead, not even static. The tunnel outside seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, the beam from the train's headlights swallowed by a darkness that appeared thicker than it should have been. The air in the cabin grew colder, my breath forming small clouds in front of my face. The temperature gauge still showed normal, but I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. The train speed indicator was showing our normal cruising speed of 40 miles per hour, but somehow the tunnel walls seemed to be moving past more slowly than they should have been. That's when I noticed something in the darkness ahead, shapes moving along the tunnel walls. At first, I thought they were shadows cast by the train's headlight, but they were moving in the wrong direction, flowing against the train's movement like dark water running uphill. As I watched, the shapes seemed to become more defined, taking on forms that looked almost human, but elongated and distorted. The radio suddenly burst to life again, but instead of static, I heard what sounded like an old train announcement, the kind they used to make decades ago. Now approaching Ash Street Station. End of the line. All passengers must exit. My blood ran cold. Ash Street Station had been closed and sealed off in 1954 after a terrible accident, a fire that had killed dozens of passengers. The station didn't even appear on modern maps anymore, and I had always assumed it had been demolished during later tunnel renovations. But now, through the darkness ahead, I could see lights appearing. Not the modern LED service lights, but old incandescent bulbs, their yellow glow revealing an approaching platform. The station signs became visible through the gloom. ASH Street Station, written in faded Art Deco lettering. I hit the emergency brakes, but nothing happened. The train continued its steady pace toward the platform. The control panel was completely unresponsive, all the buttons dead under my fingers. Through the windows, I could now see the platform clearly. It looked perfectly preserved, as if the fire had never happened. There were even people standing on it, waiting for the train, but something was wrong about them. Their clothes were old-fashioned, like the woman's had been, and they stood too still, too rigid. As the train drew closer, I could see their faces, or rather, the absence of faces. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, blank skin, like mannequins. Yet somehow, I knew they were all looking at me. The train began to slow down on its own, as if preparing to stop at the platform. The door's activation lights came on, indicating they were preparing to open. In desperation, I tried the emergency door locks, but like everything else, they didn't respond. That's when I heard it, a sound coming from the passenger cars behind me. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward the driver's cabin. Through the CCTV monitor, I could see a figure walking through the middle car, the old woman, but something was different about her. She moved wrong, her joints bending in impossible ways, and her face was like those of the figures on the platform. The footsteps got closer, and I could hear something else now, a sound like dry paper rustling, or perhaps ancient cloth dragging along the floor. The temperature dropped even further, frost beginning to form on the inside of the windows. The old woman had reached the door to my cabin, and I could hear her hand scraping against it, trying to find the handle. In that moment of pure terror, I remembered something, an old emergency protocol that hadn't been used in years. Every driver's cabin had a manual override lever hidden behind a panel under the main controls. It would disengage all electronic systems and activate the emergency brakes mechanically. The catch was, using it would probably damage the train beyond repair, and any driver who pulled it without a provable emergency would be fired instantly. The door handle began to turn. I ripped open the panel and grabbed the lever, pulling it with all my strength. The effect was immediate and violent. A horrible screech filled the air as the brakes engaged, sparks flying from the wheels. The train shuddered so hard I thought it would derail. I was thrown against the control panel, my head hitting something hard. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the cabin. The emergency lights were on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. Through the windows, I could see regular service lights in the tunnel, modern LED ones. The radio was working again, filled with concerned voices from control asking about my status. The train had stopped about half a mile from the next station. When the emergency response team reached me, they found all the train systems had been completely fried by the emergency brake activation. The CCTV recordings were corrupted, showing only static. There was no sign of any passenger having been on the train, and no trace of Ash Street Station, just the same curved tunnel walls I'd passed hundreds of times before. The official investigation concluded that I had experienced a stress-induced hallucination, possibly caused by carbon dioxide buildup in the tunnel section. They pointed out that there was no physical evidence of anything unusual happening, and the train's data recorder showed normal operation until I pulled the emergency lever. I was suspended for 2 weeks and required to undergo a psychiatric evaluation before returning to work. The doctor suggested that years of working the night shift had affected my sleep patterns, leading to an episode of parasomnia, essentially a waking dream. She prescribed some medication and recommended I switch to day shifts. But I know what I saw, and I'm not the only one. During my suspension, I did some research, spending hours in the city library's archives. It turns out there have been other incidents on that section of the Blue Line. Other drivers who reported strange sightings, mysterious passengers, and inexplicable events. Most of the reports were from years ago, and all were officially explained away or dismissed. I found something else too, an old newspaper article from 1954 describing the Ash Street Station fire. According to the article, the fire started when the last train of the night arrived at the platform. Witnesses reported seeing an elderly woman in dark clothing walking through the cars just before the blaze broke out. She was never identified, and her body was never found. The article included a photo of the platform before it was sealed off. In the background, barely visible through the smoke damage, you can see the Art Deco station sign. And below it, written in smaller letters, "End of the line. All passengers must exit." I'm back at work now, but I requested a transfer to the Green Line. It's a newer route, all modern tunnels and equipment. No abandoned stations, no hidden platforms, no history. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that section of the Blue Line, running deep beneath the old city. I think about that empty platform, waiting in the darkness, and the passengers who might still be waiting there, watching for the last train of the night. And I wonder about that elderly woman, still riding the midnight trains, looking for new passengers to join her at the end of the line. So if you ever find yourself on a late-night train, and you see an old woman in a dark dress sitting alone in an empty car, whatever you do, don't catch her eye. Don't look at her face. And if you hear an announcement for Ash Street Station, close your eyes, keep them closed, and pray that your train doesn't stop. Because sometimes, the end of the line isn't where you think it is. And sometimes, the last train of the night goes places that aren't on any map. I never should have taken that job at Riverside Storage Complex, the graveyard shift at a massive storage facility on the outskirts of town, where the urban sprawl dissolves into abandoned industrial parks and overgrown fields. It was a recipe for disaster from the start. But when you're desperate for work and have a criminal record hanging over your head, you learn to take what you can get. The facility itself was enormous, 5 floors of climate-controlled storage units stretching across 3 buildings, connected by covered walkways and service corridors. During the day, it was busy enough, with people constantly moving things in and out. But at night, it transformed into something else entirely, a maze of identical hallways, metal doors, and shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. My job was simple: patrol the buildings every 2 hours, monitor the security cameras, and make sure nothing unusual happened between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. The pay wasn't great, but it came with a small apartment on site. A converted office space on the ground floor of Building C, free rent and utilities were hard to pass up, especially with my background making it difficult to find landlords willing to take a chance on me. The first few weeks were uneventful. The night shift was lonely, but I had gotten used to solitude during my time inside. I spent my hours walking the endless corridors, checking locks, and watching the security feeds. Sometimes I'd hear strange noises, scratching sounds, metallic clangs, or what sounded like whispered conversations. But that was normal in a building this size. The ventilation system played tricks with sound, carrying noises from one end of the facility to the other in ways that could seem unsettling if you thought about it too much. It was during my 3rd month on the job that things started to change. I had just finished my midnight patrol and was back in the security office, going through the camera feeds, when I noticed something odd about Unit 4721 in Building B. The light above the door was flickering, which shouldn't have been possible. The hallway lights were all on the same circuit, and none of the others were affected. I made a note to have maintenance check it in the morning and continued my routine. But as I cycled through the cameras, I kept coming back to that unit. Something about it bothered me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what. I pulled up the facilities database and looked up the unit's rental history. Unit 4721 had been rented by the same person for the past 15 years, a Dr. Marcus Chen. The rental agreement listed him as a research scientist, but provided no other details. His payments were automatic, deducted from an account that never showed any signs of running low. In 15 years, he had accessed the unit exactly once, the day he rented it. I shouldn't have been curious. The cardinal rule of storage facility work is that you don't ask questions about what people store. But something about that single visit in 15 years, combined with that impossibly flickering light, got under my skin. I found myself pulling up more information about Dr. Chun. There wasn't much, just a few old newspaper articles from the local paper. He had worked at a private research facility called Meridian Laboratories, which had shut down abruptly 15 years ago, following what was described as a containment incident. The details were vague, but there had been several deaths, and the facility had been demolished shortly afterward. The timing matched perfectly with when Dr. Chun had rented the storage unit. I knew I should leave it alone. My job was to patrol and observe, not investigate. But during my 2 a.m. rounds, I found myself taking a detour to Building B, 4th floor. The flickering light was still there, casting strange shadows that seemed to move in ways that didn't quite match the rhythm of the flickering. As I approached Unit 4721, the temperature dropped noticeably. In a climate-controlled building, this shouldn't have been possible, but I could see my breath forming clouds in front of me. The metal door looked like all the others, gray, unremarkable, secured with a heavy padlock, but something about it felt wrong. The air around it seemed thicker somehow, as if the space itself was distorted. I stood there for a long moment, listening. At first, there was only the usual ambient noise of the building, the hum of ventilation, the distant drone of the industrial air conditioners. But as I focused, I began to hear something else coming from inside the unit, a low, pulsing sound, just at the edge of hearing. It was like a heartbeat, but not quite organic, with an electrical undertone that made my teeth ache. I should have walked away, should have gone back to my office, finished my shift, and never given Unit 4721 another thought. But instead, I found myself reaching for my master key ring. As security supervisor, I had access to every unit in case of emergencies. We were only supposed to use the keys if we suspected immediate danger to the facility or other renters' property. Looking back, I wish I had remembered that rule. The padlock was ice cold, so cold it almost burned my fingers as I inserted the key. It turned with difficulty, as if something inside the lock was resisting. When it finally clicked open, the sound echoed down the hallway in a way that seemed impossible, reverberating much longer than it should have. I hesitated with my hand on the door handle. The pulsing sound was louder now, and I could feel it in my chest, like a second heartbeat trying to override my own. The flickering light above cast crazy shadows around me, making it seem like the hallway was breathing, expanding, and contracting with each pulse. Common sense screamed at me to stop, to close the lock and walk away. But something else, something deeper and more primitive, pushed me forward. I needed to know what was behind that door. Needed to understand why the air felt wrong, why the light flickered, why Dr. Chun had never returned. I pulled the door open. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Ozone and something else something chemical and alien that made my sinuses burn. The unit was larger than it should have been, much larger. Storage units were standard sizes, and this one should have been 10 by 15 feet. But the space in front of me seemed to stretch back into impossible darkness, the walls curving in ways that violated basic geometry. In the center of the room stood what looked like a piece of scientific equipment, a metal framework surrounding a glass cylinder that reached from floor to ceiling. Inside the cylinder was something. It looked like liquid at first, black and oily, but it moved wrong. It flowed upward instead of down, forming patterns and shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. The pulsing sound was coming from it, and now I could see that the liquid was actually pulsing in time with the sound, expanding and contracting like a heart made of living darkness. The walls of the unit were covered in papers, hundreds of pages of scientific notes, diagrams, and equations that made no sense. They were handwritten in increasingly erratic script, the later pages descending into what looked like madness, the equations giving way to desperate warnings and pleas written in multiple languages, some of which didn't look human. As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, the liquid in the cylinder noticed me. I don't know how else to describe it. The patterns it was forming suddenly became more focused, more deliberate. It pressed against the glass, forming what looked like a face, or rather, dozens of faces, all trying to emerge at once, all silently screaming. The temperature dropped even further, frost forming on the metal framework. The pulsing sound changed pitch, becoming higher, more urgent. Papers began to flutter on the walls, though there was no wind. And then I saw the cracks in the glass, tiny fissures spreading out from where the liquid pressed against it, forming patterns like black lightning. I backed away, my heart pounding in sync with that awful pulse. As I reached for the door, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, one of the papers detaching from the wall and floating toward me. I grabbed it instinctively, and in the flickering light from the hallway, I could read Dr. Chen's desperate scrawl. "If you're reading this, close the door. Close it now. It's gotten stronger over the years. The containment won't hold much longer. I'm sorry. I thought I could control it, study it, understand it. But it understands us far better than we could ever understand it. And it's so hungry." The glass cylinder cracked louder, a sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake. I slammed the door shut and locked it, hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the padlock. As I backed away, I could still hear that pulsing sound, but now it was accompanied by something else, a high, thin sound, like laughter but not quite, as if something was trying to remember how humans laugh. I ran back to the security office and pulled up the camera feed for the fourth-floor hallway. The light above Unit 4721 had stopped flickering, but as I watched, a dark liquid began seeping out from under the door. It moved against gravity, flowing up the wall like ink in water, forming those same impossible patterns I had seen in the cylinder. I grabbed my phone to call someone. The police? The FBI? Who do you call when you find something like that? But before I could dial, every light in the facility went out at once. The emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in red, and every phone line went dead simultaneously. The security monitors showed the black liquid spreading through the building, flowing through vents, under doors, through tiny cracks in the walls. Wherever it went, the security cameras began to fail, one by one, showing only static before going dark. And in that static, just before each camera died, I could see faces forming, desperate, twisted faces that seemed to be trying to warn me, or beg for help, or maybe just scream. I ran, left everything behind and just ran, out of the building and into the night. Behind me, I could hear that sound, that awful, almost laughter, echoing through the facility. As I reached my car, I looked back. In the red glow of the emergency lights, I could see something moving behind every window of the storage complex, something dark and fluid and alive, filling the building like water filling a glass. I drove until I ran out of gas, ending up at a truck stop 50 miles away. When I finally got up the courage to call the police, they found nothing unusual at Riverside Storage Complex. The security cameras showed no sign of malfunction, the lights worked perfectly, and Unit 4721 was empty. Completely empty. No equipment, no papers, nothing but dust. They didn't believe my story, of course. Tests showed traces of carbon monoxide in the building's ventilation system. Not enough to be dangerous, they said, but enough to cause hallucinations. They suggested I seek counseling for work-related stress and recommended I find a new job. But I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there, whatever it is. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear that pulsing sound, still see those patterns forming in the shadows. I've tried to find Dr. Chin to understand what he created or discovered, but he seems to have vanished completely after that containment incident 15 years ago. I checked the news obsessively, looking for signs. Strange disappearances, unexplained phenomena, anything that might suggest that thing has gotten loose. So far, nothing. But sometimes, when I'm driving past storage facilities or industrial buildings, I see lights flickering in windows, forming patterns that remind me of that night. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see something dark and fluid moving behind those windows, forming faces that seem to recognize me. I've moved 4 times since that night, each time further away from Riverside Storage Complex. But distance doesn't seem to matter. The other night, I woke up to find my bedroom light flickering, casting shadows that moved in ways they shouldn't. And in the corner of my room, I saw something that looked like liquid darkness beginning to seep through the wall. I'm writing this as a warning. If you work nights at a storage facility, or anywhere else where the shadows are long and the silence is deep, pay attention to the lights. If you see them flickering in patterns that don't make sense, if you feel the air grow thick and cold, if you hear a sound like a heartbeat that doesn't match your own, run. Run as far and as fast as you can. And if you ever come across Unit 4721, or Dr. Marcus Chin, or anything that moves like liquid but casts shadows like something solid, don't open the door. Don't try to understand it. Just turn around and walk away. Because some things aren't meant to be contained, and some doors aren't meant to be opened. I dream about that unit sometimes. In my dreams, I'm standing in front of that door again, watching black liquid seep through the cracks. But in the dreams, I can hear voices coming from inside. Hundreds of voices, all speaking at once in languages I don't understand. They're trying to tell me something, trying to warn me about what's coming. Because that's the thing about containment, it's never permanent. Everything escapes eventually. And I have a feeling that whatever was in Unit 4721 has been patient, so patient, gradually wearing away at its prison one molecule at a time, spreading through the building's infrastructure, learning, growing stronger. I've started seeing the patterns everywhere now, in water stains on buildings, in oil slicks on puddles, in the way shadows move when you're not looking directly at them. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear that almost laughter again, closer each time. So if you're reading this, consider it a warning. Watch the shadows in your storage facility, your office building, your home. Watch for patterns that shouldn't be there, for movements that don't follow the rules of physics. And if you ever hear a sound like a heartbeat that isn't yours, or see liquid flowing upward instead of down, or notice lights flickering in ways that make your eyes hurt, don't investigate. Don't try to understand. Just close the door, walk away, and pray that whatever Dr. Chin found, whatever he thought he could contain in that unit, never finds its way to where you are. Because some questions shouldn't be answered, some doors shouldn't be opened, and some things should stay locked away forever. But deep down, I know it's too late. Whatever was in Unit 4721 is out there now, spreading, growing, waiting. And sooner or later, it's going to find me. Because once you've seen it, once you've heard that pulse and seen those patterns, it never really lets you go. So if you're thinking about taking that night shift job at a storage facility, my advice is simple: don't. Some things are worth more than a steady paycheck and free rent. And some mysteries are better left unsolved. Because in the end, the true horror isn't what's locked behind those storage unit doors. It's the knowledge that sometimes the doors aren't enough to keep things contained. And sometimes the real nightmare begins not when you open the door, but when you realize that what was behind it has been watching you all along, waiting patiently for someone curious enough or desperate enough to give it the chance it needed to escape. And now it's free. I should have known something was wrong when they offered me the position at Black Rock Lighthouse with barely a glance at my credentials. 6 months of isolation on a remote island 20 miles off the coast. maintaining one of the last manually operated lighthouses in the country. It wasn't the kind of job they usually gave to someone with my limited experience. But I was desperate to escape my life on the mainland, and they were desperate to fill the position after the mysterious disappearance of the previous keeper. The helicopter ride out to Black Rock Island was my first indication of just how isolated the posting would be. Nothing but gray waves in every direction, stretching to a horizon that seemed to blur the boundary between sea and sky. The island itself was little more than a giant rock thrust up from the ocean floor, black volcanic stone worn smooth by centuries of storms, with the lighthouse perched at its highest point like a lone sentinel. Last chance to change your mind. The pilot shouted over the roar of the rotors as we approached. Once I leave, you're here until the supply run next month. Weather permitting, of course. I shook my head, clutching my duffel bag closer. The lighthouse grew larger as we descended. A stark white tower rising 150 feet into the air, with a small cluster of buildings at its base. My home for the next 6 months. The pilot helped me unload my supplies and gave me a final warning about the approaching storm system before departing, leaving me alone with the endless sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. The keeper's cottage was small but well maintained, with a kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, and a small office filled with logbooks and weather monitoring equipment. Solar panels and a backup generator provided power, and a satellite phone offered emergency communication with the mainland. The lighthouse itself was a marvel of Victorian engineering, its iron spiral staircase leading up to the lantern room at the top. The massive Fresnel lens was a complex array of prisms and mirrors designed to project the light beam up to 20 miles out to sea. My job was simple: keep the mechanism running, maintain the logbooks, and ensure the light stayed on during the night hours. Modern automation handled most of the work, but regulations required a human presence to monitor the systems and perform maintenance. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I fell into a routine, checking the weather instruments, maintaining the equipment, updating the logs. During the day, I explored the island, though there wasn't much to see beyond bare rock and the occasional seabird nest. At night, I would sit in the lantern room, watching the beam sweep across the dark water while listening to the wind howl around the tower. It was during one of these night watches that I first noticed something odd. I was updating the logbook when I heard what sounded like singing, a distant, haunting melody carried on the wind. It was too structured to be the natural sounds of the island, but too alien to be human. When I went to the window to look, the singing stopped abruptly, leaving only the usual sounds of wind and waves. I might have dismissed it as imagination if not for what happened the next day. While reviewing the previous keeper's logbooks, I found entries describing similar sounds. The entries grew increasingly erratic over time, describing not just singing but strange lights in the water and shapes moving in the darkness beyond the lighthouse beam. The final entry, dated just days before his disappearance, contained a single sentence: "They're not in the water anymore. They're in the walls." That night, the storm the pilot had warned about finally hit. The wind grew fierce enough to shake the entire tower, and waves crashed high enough to spray the lower windows. I was in the lantern room, making sure the light remained stable, when the power went out. The backup generator kicked in immediately, but in that brief moment of darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were lights in the water, dozens of them, glowing with a pale blue-green luminescence that couldn't be explained by bioluminescent organisms. They moved with purpose, forming patterns that seemed almost like writing in some alien script. As I watched, they began to move toward the island, flowing against the current with impossible precision. The generator sputtered, causing the lighthouse beam to flicker. In those moments of darkness, I could see more lights emerging from the depths, and now they were accompanied by shapes, vast, shadowy forms that seemed to shift and change as they moved through the water. The singing started again, louder this time, and with it came a deep thrumming that I could feel in my bones. I grabbed the satellite phone to call for help, but there was only static, punctuated by sounds that might have been words in a language never meant for human tongues. The temperature in the lantern room dropped rapidly, frost forming on the windows despite the summer night. And then I saw them, handprints appearing in the frost, pressed against the glass from the outside. At the top of the lighthouse, 150 feet above the water, The generator failed completely, plunging the lighthouse into darkness. In the sudden quiet, I could hear something moving on the stairs below, a wet, sliding sound accompanied by that same otherworldly singing. The logbook entries flashed through my mind. There in the walls, I pulled out my flashlight with trembling hands. The beam seemed weak, as if the darkness itself was consuming the light. Water was seeping up through the floorboards, but it moved wrong, flowing upward instead of down, forming patterns like the lights I'd seen in the ocean. The singing grew louder, and with it came words I could almost understand, almost grasp, if I just listened a little harder. I clamped my hands over my ears, fighting the urge to listen. The previous keeper's final log entry had continued on the next page. I remembered now. The singing. It gets in your head, makes you want to understand. But once you understand, you're already lost. The temperature dropped further, my breath forming clouds in the beam of the flashlight. The water was halfway up the walls now, defying gravity, and in its shifting patterns I could see faces forming. Not human faces, but something that had perhaps once studied humans and was trying to recreate what it had seen, without quite understanding how faces were supposed to work. I backed away from the spreading water until I hit the railing around the lens. Below, the singing had reached a fever pitch, and I could hear something heavy dragging itself up the spiral staircase. The handprints on the windows multiplied, pressing harder, the glass beginning to crack under the pressure. That's when I saw it reflected in the lens, a shape in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness. It was roughly humanoid, but wrong in ways my mind couldn't quite process. It moved like something that had learned about joints and bones from technical diagrams rather than experience, and its proportions seemed to shift and change every time I blinked. It reached out toward me with what might have been a hand, water dripping upward from its fingers to join the impossible patterns flowing across the ceiling. The singing reached a crescendo, and with it came understanding, terrible, mind-shattering understanding of what these things were, where they came from, why they had chosen this remote lighthouse as their point of contact. They were old, so impossibly old. They had been here before the first fish crawled onto land, before the first cells joined together to form complex life. They had slept in the deep places of the ocean, dreaming their alien dreams, until human activity, sonar, deep-sea drilling, underwater testing, had awakened them. And now they were curious about the creatures that had disturbed their slumber. The previous keeper hadn't disappeared. I realized with dawning horror. He had been taken, studied, examined, pulled apart, and put back together by beings trying to understand how humans worked. And now they had come for me. The thing in the doorway took another step forward, its movements like a stick figure animation drawn by someone who had only heard descriptions of how humans walked. The water patterns on the walls began to spiral, forming a vortex that seemed to lead somewhere else, somewhere that light and physics worked differently. The singing had become a physical force, pressing against my mind, trying to pull me into that impossible understanding. In desperation, I turned my flashlight on the creature. For a split second, I saw it clearly, really saw it, and my mind recoiled from what it was seeing. This thing had never been human, never been anything that lived on Earth. It was a probe, a tool, an extension of something vast and unthinkable that waited in the deep, reaching up through miles of ocean to study the strange creatures that lived in the air and light. The flashlight beam seemed to disturb it. It recoiled, its form becoming even more unstable, and the singing took on a different tone. Surprise, perhaps, or pain. I remembered reading somewhere that deep-sea creatures often couldn't handle direct light. Operating on instinct, I began to turn the lighthouse lens, manually rotating it toward the doorway. The beam caught the creature full on, and the effect was immediate and horrifying. Its form began to dissolve, running like wax, while the singing turned into a high-pitched keening that made my ears bleed. The water patterns on the walls recoiled, flowing back down toward the floor, and I heard splashing on the stairs as something heavy retreated rapidly downward. I kept turning the lens, sweeping the beam around the room, driving back the darkness and the things that lived in it. The temperature began to rise, the frost on the windows melting. The handprints faded, and the singing grew more distant, fading back into the sound of wind and waves. The generator suddenly roared back to life. and the lighthouse beam resumed its automatic rotation. I stood there trembling, watching as the lights in the water retreated back into the depths, taking their impossible geometries and alien songs with them. When the supply helicopter arrived a month later, they found me still manning my post. I told them nothing about what had happened. Who would believe me? Instead, I submitted my resignation, citing health reasons. They seemed unsurprised. Apparently, few keepers lasted more than a few months at Black Rock Lighthouse. But before I left, I added my own entry to the logbook, hidden in code among mundane observations about weather and equipment maintenance. A warning to the next keeper: if they know how to read it, they're still out there, watching, waiting. They're curious about us, but it's the curiosity of a child pulling wings off insects. They don't understand us, and they want to. They want to understand us so badly. Don't let them. Don't listen to the singing. And always, always keep the light burning. I dream about that night sometimes. In my dreams, I'm back in the lantern room, but this time the light doesn't drive them away. Instead, it reveals them in all their horror, vast shapes rising from the ocean, their geometry an offense to reality itself. They reach for me with limbs that shouldn't exist, while their singing pulls apart my mind, replacing my thoughts with their alien patterns. I've taken a job inland, as far from the ocean as I could get, but sometimes, on rainy nights, I think I hear that singing again, carried on the wind. And sometimes, when I look in mirrors or windows, I see handprints forming in the glass, reaching out from somewhere that isn't quite here, trying to pull me back to that lighthouse and the things that wait in the deep. Because that's the truth about lighthouses. They don't just guide ships away from dangerous waters. Some of them stand guard over places where the boundary between our world and others has grown thin. Places where things that should not exist reach up from the depths, trying to understand the creatures that live in the light. And somewhere out there, off a rocky coast, a lonely lighthouse still sweeps its beam across dark waters, holding back things that were old when the continents were young. Its light keeps burning, night after night, maintained by another keeper who might, even now, be hearing a strange and distant singing carried on the wind. I pray they're stronger than I was. I pray they don't try to understand. Because once you understand, you can never stop understanding. And the things you understand will never, ever stop trying to understand you back. Hey there, night owls. I hope these stories kept you on the edge of your seat tonight. If you enjoyed our journey into the darkness, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to join our growing community of horror fans. We post new terrifying tales every week, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Leave a comment below if you've ever experienced anything strange during the night shift. Your story might be featured in our next video. And don't forget to ring that notification bell to be the first to hear our next batch of horror stories. Until then, sleep tight, if you can. See you in the darkness. Hi everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you watched this video to help you fall asleep. So before you drift off, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, settle in, get cozy, and relax with me. Let's start. Sarah and I had always dreamed of owning a Victorian house. When we found the listing for 47 Maple Street, with its weathered gables and wraparound porch, it seemed too good to be true. The price was well within our budget, suspiciously so, looking back, and the realtor was eager to close the deal. Perhaps we should have questioned why such a magnificent property was priced so modestly, but love has a way of clouding judgment. The house stood at the end of a quiet street in a small New England town, its faded blue paint peeling like old memories ready to be shed. Towering oak trees flanked the property, their branches creating intricate shadows that danced across the lawn. The previous owners had left abruptly, we were told, due to a job relocation. Their furniture still occupied some rooms, covered in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. "It's perfect," Sarah whispered when we first walked through the creaking front door. Her eyes sparkled as she took in the original hardwood floors, the ornate crown molding, and the grand staircase that curved up to the second floor. I had to agree. It was everything we'd hoped for in our first home together. The moving process was straightforward enough. We spent the first few days painting walls, replacing light fixtures, and making the space our own. The house seemed to respond positively to our presence, as if awakening from a long slumber. The autumn sunlight streamed through the tall windows, warming the rooms and casting golden patterns on the walls. It was during our first week that we discovered the journal. Sarah was cleaning out the built-in bookshelf in the study when she found it wedged behind a loose panel. The leather-bound book was weathered, its pages yellow with age. Inside, dated entries spanning from 1987 to 1988 detailed the experiences of a previous owner, Elizabeth Chun. "Listen to this," Sarah said, perching on the window seat. October 15th, 1987. "The music box in the attic played again today. I know I didn't wind it. James says I'm imagining things, but I know what I heard. The melody is always the same, a lullaby I can't quite place." I shrugged it off as the imaginings of a previous owner, but Sarah became fascinated with Elizabeth's writings. She spent evenings poring over the journal, occasionally reading passages aloud that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Elizabeth wrote about cold spots that appeared and disappeared, about objects that moved on their own, and about dreams that felt more like memories of events she'd never experienced. The first incident we couldn't explain happened 3 weeks after we moved in. I was working late in the study, grading papers for my high school English class, when I heard piano music drifting up from the first floor. The notes were hesitant, like someone picking out a melody they half remembered. I assumed Sarah was playing on the old upright in the living room, though I didn't know she could play. When I went downstairs to investigate, the living room was empty. The piano stood silent, its yellowed keys untouched. Sarah was already in bed, reading. "I thought you were playing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up from her book, confused. "I don't play piano. You know that." We both heard the music after that, always late at night, always the same fragmentary melody. Sometimes it was accompanied by the sound of footsteps on the stairs, though we never saw anyone. Sarah began to document our experiences in her own journal, drawing parallels between what was happening to us and what Elizabeth had written about 30 years earlier. The dreams started next. They weren't nightmares exactly, but they left us both unsettled. In mine, I was always searching for something in the house. Opening doors, looking under furniture, checking behind walls. I never knew what I was looking for, but the sense of urgency was overwhelming. Sarah's dreams were more specific. She dreamed of a young woman in a blue dress, sitting at the piano, endlessly practicing the same piece of music. One morning, Sarah woke up crying. "She's so sad," she said when I asked what was wrong. "She's been waiting so long." "Who has?" "Emily, the girl in the blue dress." I hadn't told Sarah about my research, but I'd been digging into the house's history. There had been an Emily Sullivan, the daughter of the house's original owners. She died in 1912 at the age of 19. According to newspaper archives, she'd been a promising pianist who died under mysterious circumstances. The article mentioned that she was found at the piano. Sheet music for an unfinished composition spread before her. The activity in the house intensified after that. Objects would move when we weren't looking. We'd find all the doors open in the morning, though we'd closed them the night before. The piano music became louder, more insistent. Sometimes we'd hear what sounded like someone running up and down the stairs, their footsteps urgent and heavy. Sarah became convinced that Emily was trying to communicate with us. She started leaving sheet music on the piano, hoping to encourage some kind of interaction. I remained skeptical, but I couldn't deny that something strange was happening in our home. The turning point came on a cold November night. We'd been in the house for 2 months, and the activity had reached a fever pitch. The piano music had been playing for hours, louder than ever before. Sarah sat in the living room, watching the keys move on their own, while I paced nervously behind her. Suddenly, the music stopped. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and we could see our breath in the air. Sarah stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on a point near the piano. I couldn't see anything, but I felt a presence, something old and sad and desperate to be heard. "She wants to finish it," Sarah whispered. "The composition. She never got to finish it." What happened next defies explanation. Sarah walked to the piano and sat down. Though she'd never played before, her fingers found the keys with certainty. The melody that emerged was the same one we'd been hearing for weeks. But this time it continued past the point where it usually stopped. Sarah played for nearly an hour, her hands moving as if guided by an invisible force. When she finished, she was crying, but smiling. "It's done," she said simply. She can rest now. The house felt different after that night. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the strange occurrences gradually ceased. We still hear the piano occasionally, but it's distant now, like an echo of a memory. The song Sarah played that night, Emily's final composition, was eventually published. Music scholars were fascinated by its complexity and emotional depth. Sharon Miller hadn't meant to take the late bus. The 11:45 p.m. from Portland to Augusta wasn't her usual route, but the conference had run long, and her car was in the shop again. As she climbed aboard the nearly empty Greyhound, a chill ran down her spine despite the muggy August heat. The bus driver didn't look up as she showed her ticket. His weathered face remained fixed on some distant point through the windshield, hands gripping the wheel though the engine wasn't even running. Sharon made her way down the aisle, past an elderly woman clutching a cat carrier and a businessman absorbed in his phone. She chose a seat near the middle, away from the handful of other passengers. At 35, Sharon had spent enough time on the road as a pharmaceutical sales rep to know the unwritten rules of late-night bus travel. Minimal eye contact, headphones in, and stay alert. The divorce 6 months ago had forced her to take more late routes like this one. The custody arrangement with Mark meant she had to cram her sales calls into fewer days, often working late to compensate. The familiar diesel rumble filled the air as they pulled out of the station. Through the grimy window, Sharon watched Portland's lights fade into the darkness of rural Maine. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon, suburban sprawl giving way to dense forest on both sides. She checked her phone. No signal. Of course. Sharon pulled out her phone again, hoping to distract herself with some mindless scrolling. The screen flickered to life, but something was wrong with the display. The time showed 1:47 a.m., but that couldn't be right. They'd only been on the road for about half an hour. And the date? The date showed August 15th, but today was definitely the 14th. That's when she noticed something odd about the reflections in her window. The businessman's face looked wrong somehow. In the glass, his features seemed to shift and flow like wax, eyes too dark and mouth too wide. Sharon blinked hard and looked back directly at him. Normal. Just a tired-looking middle-aged man in a rumpled suit. She was letting her imagination run wild. The elderly woman's cat started to yowl, a sound that raised the hair on Sharon's arms. It wasn't the usual angry cat-and-carrier cry, but something almost human. The woman whispered soothingly to it, but her own voice seemed to waver and distort. "Hush now, precious. We're almost there. Almost there." A memory surfaced, unwanted. 3 years ago, working this same territory, she'd heard stories from local doctors about patients who'd gone missing along this stretch of highway. The police had dismissed it. People leave, people run away, especially from small towns. But one elderly doctor, close to retirement and too tired to care about sounding crazy, had told her something different. "It's the night roads," he'd said, hands shaking slightly as he signed for her samples. "They change after midnight. My grandfather used to tell me stories about routes that aren't on any map, buses that never reach their destination." The overhead lights began to flicker, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of the bus's motion. Sharon gripped her armrest tighter, knuckles white. Through the window, she could no longer see any other traffic on the highway. No distant farmhouse lights. Nothing but the endless trees and the increasingly strange reflections in the glass. She checked her watch. 12:15 a.m. They should be approaching the Augusta outskirts, but the forest pressing in on both sides looked unfamiliar. The trees seemed too tall, too close to the road. Their branches reached over the highway like grasping fingers, blotting out the stars. The cat's cries grew louder, more desperate. Sharon noticed the businessman had put down his phone. He was staring straight ahead, face blank, too blank, like a mask. "Next stop," the driver announced suddenly, his voice crackling through the speakers. But that couldn't be right. They were in the middle of nowhere, miles from any town. The bus began to slow. Sharon's heart pounded as they pulled onto a narrow shoulder. Through the trees, she could just make out what looked like an old bus shelter. a simple metal overhang thick with rust and ivy. No lights, no sign, nothing to indicate an official stop. The elderly woman stood, gathering her carrier. The cat had gone silent. "Ma'am," Sharon called out, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't think this is a real stop. We're not anywhere near." The woman turned, and Sharon's words died in her throat. In the dim overhead lights, the old woman's face was melting, skin dripping like candle wax to reveal something dark and chitinous underneath. The businessman stood too, his suit rippling as though filled with crawling insects. Sharon lunged for the emergency exit handle, but her fingers passed right through it like smoke. The driver's reflection in the rearview mirror showed only empty space where his face should be. "Last stop," he announced again, his voice no longer human. Everyone off. Panic surged through Sharon's veins as she scrambled over the back of her seat, away from the advancing figures. The businessman's suit had split open now, revealing a writhing mass of darkness beneath. The old woman's cat carrier had transformed into something that looked like a cage made of bones, containing nothing but shadows and clicking sounds. The bus's interior began to stretch and distort, the aisle growing longer, the windows warping into impossible shapes. Sharon stumbled toward the back, her feet suddenly heavy as though moving through thick mud. The air had become dense, carrying the smell of wet earth and decay. "You can't leave," the thing that had been the businessman said, its voice a chorus of whispers. "No one leaves the midnight route." Sharon's back hit the rear emergency door. Through the window, she could see the bus shelter had changed too. It was larger now, its metal frame twisting up into the trees like a skeletal hand reaching for the sky. Dark figures moved beneath it, their forms suggesting shapes that human minds were never meant to comprehend. The driver stood from his seat, unfolding into something tall and spindly, his uniform falling away to reveal glossy black segments like an insect's carapace. "We have been collecting passengers for centuries," it said, mandibles clicking. "The night roads are our hunting grounds. The midnight routes are snares." Sharon's mind raced through her sales routes, all those late-night drives, all those missing person reports she'd glimpsed in local papers. How many others had taken the last bus? How many had disappeared into whatever nightmare realm waited at that final stop? The emergency handle felt solid now beneath her fingers. Whatever force had made it intangible before had weakened as the beings revealed their true forms. Sharon gripped it tight, her other hand finding the small canister of pepper spray she always carried in her jacket pocket. The creature that had been the old woman reached for her with hands that were now long, jointed things like spiders' legs. "Join us," it chittered. "Become part of the midnight route. Forever." Sharon yanked the emergency handle and sprayed the pepper spray in a wide arc. The creatures recoiled, their forms wavering like heat mirages. She didn't wait to see more. She threw herself backward through the emergency door, hitting the ground hard and rolling into the ditch beside the road. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, but Sharon forced herself to her feet. She ran into the forest, away from the bus shelter and its waiting horrors. Branches whipped at her face as she crashed through the underbrush. Behind her, she could hear inhuman screams and the sound of many-legged things pursuing through the trees. She ran until her legs burned and her lungs felt like they would burst. When she finally stopped, gasping for air, the forest around her had changed. The trees were normal-sized again, their branches no longer reaching like claws. In the distance, she could see the lights of what looked like a gas station. Sharon's phone buzzed in her pocket. Signal had returned. The screen showed 12:30 a.m., August 14th. She pulled up her Maps app with trembling fingers. She was only 3 miles outside of Augusta, somehow. As she walked toward the gas station's lights, Sharon thought about all the routes she'd have to change now, all the night drives she'd have to rearrange. She thought about the missing persons reports she'd start collecting, looking for patterns, for others who might have taken the midnight route. Most of all, she thought about the old doctor's words, about roads that change after midnight. She thought about how many other bus routes might run through the dark places of the world, collecting passengers for things that hunted along the night roads. The next morning, the Augusta Greyhound station would report that the 11:45 p.m. bus from Portland had arrived on schedule, completely empty. The driver would have no memory of any passengers, and the security cameras would show Sharon Miller boarding in Portland but never arriving in Augusta. But Sharon knew she'd escaped. She also knew they would be watching for her now, waiting on every midnight route, every dark highway, and sometimes, on late nights when she can't avoid driving, she still catches glimpses in her rearview mirror, faces that shift like wax, and empty bus shelters that seem to reach for the sky. David Chun had been working at the Riverside Extended Stay Hotel for 6 months when room 410 started to change people. Not in any way you'd notice right away. The changes were subtle at first. A business traveler would check in for a week, perfectly normal, and check out with a slight tremor in their left hand. A vacationing couple would arrive happy and leave with hollow eyes and matching nervous tics. David noticed because it was his job to notice. After his failed career as an art history professor, cut short by budget cuts and department politics, the night manager position hadn't been his first choice. But 3 years of unemployment had taught him to take what he could get. Besides, the night shift suited his insomnia, giving him plenty of quiet hours to work on his never-finished book about the intersection of art and madness in the early 20th century. The hotel itself was unremarkable, a 4-story brick building just off I-95, catering to business travelers and families looking for budget accommodations. Room 410 was equally standard, queen bed, generic furnishings, the same cheap prints on the walls as every other room, except for the landscape painting on the far wall. At first glance, it was nothing special. A woodland scene, all soft blues and gentle greens, a stream winding through summer trees. Hotel art at its most forgettable. But lately, David had started to wonder about that painting. He first noticed something was truly wrong when Mrs. Henderson checked in. She was a retired schoolteacher, staying while her house was being renovated. Sweet lady brought him homemade cookies on her second day. Said the room was perfect. Loved the peaceful view. On day 3, she mentioned the children playing in the painting. Such happy little ones, she'd said, her smile just a bit too wide. They wave to me at night. Want me to come play with them? There had never been any children in that painting. David had cleaned that room hundreds of times, stared at that bland landscape while changing sheets and vacuuming. Just trees, water, and sky. No figures at all. By day 5, Mrs. Henderson's gray hair had gone completely white. Her hands shook constantly, and her eyes seemed to follow things that weren't there. She checked out early, leaving behind a room that smelled of wet leaves and soil, though it hadn't rained in weeks. The incident nagged at David's academic mind. He began documenting changes in room 410's guests, keeping detailed notes in a leather-bound journal he'd once intended for research observations. The pattern was undeniable. Mr. Rossi, the traveling salesman who started talking to his reflection in the bathroom mirror, insisting it was showing him the other side of the trees, found on his last morning pressing his face against the painting's surface, whispering about the way through, the young couple, the Andersons, who stopped sleeping entirely. Security footage showed them spending nights standing motionless beneath the painting, hands clasped, heads tilted as if listening to distant music. They left without checking out, abandoning all their belongings except a sketchbook filled with drawings of childlike figures dancing between dark trees. Jenny Martinez, the teenage girl who took photos of the room for her travel blog. Her phone's memory was corrupted, every image showing dark shapes moving between the trees, getting closer to the frame in each shot. The final photo showed what looked like small handprints pressed against the inside of the picture. Each incident left its mark on the room. The wallpaper began to feel damp to the touch near the painting. The carpet developed strange patterns that looked like footprints when viewed from certain angles. The mirror started showing reflections that moved a fraction of a second too slowly. David tried removing the painting once. He waited until the room was vacant, brought his tools, and carefully lifted it from the wall. The frame was heavier than it should have been, and the wall behind it felt cold, like a window left open in winter. He took it to his office, locked it in the supply closet. The next morning, the painting was back in room 410. The replacement artwork he'd hung was shredded into tiny pieces that spelled out "wrong window" on the carpet. The supply closet was locked, exactly as he'd left it, but filled with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. Disturbed but intrigued, David began researching the hotel's history. The building records led him to a discovery that made his blood run cold. The hotel had been constructed on the former grounds of Riverside Asylum, closed in 1963 after a series of mysterious patient deaths. Diving deeper into the asylum's records, David found what he was looking for. Elizabeth Marsh, admitted in 1961. She had been a prominent local artist, known for her eerily realistic landscapes. Her breakdown came after the disappearance of her 3 children during a painting expedition in the woods. The police never found any bodies, but Elizabeth's behavior became increasingly erratic. Her admission records noted an obsession with doorways between worlds and her insistence that her paintings were becoming portals. The asylum staff had encouraged her art therapy, seeing it as harmless, until other patients began reporting strange experiences around her works. They claimed to hear children's laughter coming from her landscapes, see movement in the trees she painted. The final entry in Elizabeth's file, dated just before the asylum's closure, described her last painting, a woodland scene with a stream. The same night she completed it, Elizabeth vanished from her locked room. The staff found only her art supplies and the fresh painting on the wall, still wet in places though she'd had no paint left. The more David read, the more certain he became. The painting in room 410 was Elizabeth's final work. Somehow, during the asylum's demolition and the hotel's construction, it had survived, found its way into the building's decoration. And it was still active, still serving its intended purpose, whatever that might be. He began spending his breaks in room 410 when it was vacant, watching the painting for hours. The changes were subtle at first. Shadows that grew longer against the rules of perspective, leaves that trembled without a breeze, water that seemed to flow uphill. But the longer he watched, the more he saw. Sometimes he caught glimpses of faces in the foliage, pale, curious faces that reminded him of Elizabeth's photographs in the asylum records. Once, he saw 3 small figures dancing by the stream, their laughter like distant wind chimes. They waved to him, called him by name, though he'd never told them what it was. The dream started then. In them, David walked through those painted woods, feeling soft grass under his feet, hearing the stream's gentle murmur. Each dream took him deeper, past the trees in the foreground, following the water's winding path. The children were always just ahead, playing their eternal games of hide and seek, calling him further in. He started taking extra shifts, spending more time near room 410. The hotel manager, Linda, noticed his dedication and offered him a promotion to day shift supervisor. David declined. He couldn't leave now, not when he was so close to understanding. The guest's changes accelerated, as if the painting knew it had found a willing observer. A businessman checked in for one night and had to be carried out catatonic, his eyes fixed on something far away, hands curled into claws. His last coherent words were about the children who need a new teacher. A honeymoon couple, the Wilsons, vanished completely, leaving only wet footprints that led from the bed to the painting and stopped. Their suitcases remained untouched, except for a note written in Mrs. Wilson's hand. We see why Elizabeth did it. They just wanted to play. David watched the security footage obsessively, though the camera in 410 never worked right. The images always came through distorted, showing impossible angles and periods of complete darkness. But sometimes, in those dark frames, he caught glimpses. Figures moving in ways bodies shouldn't move, shadows that reached like hands, and always, the painting glowing softly in the background. Linda tried to talk to him about his growing obsession. She'd noticed the changes in him. The weight loss, the distracted manner, the way he'd stand in 410's doorway for hours, just staring at the painting. She suggested he take some vacation time, get some rest. David nodded, agreed, and kept watching. He started visiting the room during vacant periods, sitting in the chair by the window, watching the painted landscape slowly shift. The trees grew darker, their branches reaching like fingers. The stream began to look less like water and more like something flowing the wrong way, something thick and dark. The children appeared to him more clearly now, no longer hiding behind the trees. They played their games, sang their songs, and told him stories about Elizabeth, how she'd found them in the real woods, seen them dancing, and wanted to give them a forever home in her art. How she joined them eventually, becoming their mother again in a world where time didn't pass and no one ever had to grow up. But Elizabeth had grown tired over the years. The children needed someone new to watch over them, to keep the door open between their world and ours. They'd been waiting for someone who could really see them, understand them. Someone like David. He understood now why Elizabeth had painted this door. Not out of madness, but out of love. The children needed a guardian, someone to watch over their eternal games, to keep the door open between their world and ours. Elizabeth had grown too old, too tired. They needed someone new. On his last night, David came to room 410 with his research journal and a small bag of personal items. He'd left his resignation letter on Linda's desk, along with his unfinished manuscript about art and madness. Now he understood, you couldn't truly write about such things from the outside. The painting had changed completely by then, showing a deeper forest than before, full of impossible colors and shifting shadows. The children danced at its edge, their faces alight with joy at his arrival. Behind them, in a clearing by the stream, he could see Elizabeth, young again, smiling and holding out her hand. David stepped forward, pressing his palm against the canvas. It felt cool and liquid, like still water. The children's voices were clear now, their laughter bright and real. As he pushed through, he felt the paint flow around him, not wet but alive, pulling him gently into that other world. The hotel staff found room 410 empty the next morning, perfectly made up as always. The painting hung in its usual place, showing its usual peaceful scene. But now, if you looked carefully, you might notice a new figure among the trees. A man in modern clothes, walking hand in hand with laughing children, leading them deeper into the painted woods. Linda hired a new night manager. The painting remained, and room 410 continued to change its guests. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, you can hear children's laughter echoing through the halls. And if you look at the painting just right, you might see David Chan smiling back at you, forever young, forever watching over his charges in that other world beyond the frame. But whatever you do, don't look too long. Don't let them see you watching. And if they wave, if they call your name, if they invite you to join their games, close your eyes, turn away, and remember, not all windows are meant to be opened. Not all paintings are meant to be doors. And sometimes, the most dangerous art isn't what you can see on the canvas, but what can see you back. In her office, Linda keeps David's journal locked in her desk. Sometimes, late at night, she takes it out and reads his final entry. I understand now. It's not about escape or madness. It's about finding where you truly belong. The children are waiting. Elizabeth is waiting. And the painting has always been waiting for someone who could really see. Tommy found the box while cleaning out his grandmother's attic after the funeral. It was old, made of dark wood with brass fittings, about the size of a shoebox. No lock, just a simple latch. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, sat a single glass marble that seemed to swirl with its own inner light. His mother had warned him not to go through Grandma Rose's things alone. She kept things, Mom had said, her voice tight, things that should stay buried. But Tommy was 32 years old, for Christ's sake, and his grandmother had been just a sweet old lady who baked cookies and collected too many cats. The marble felt warm when he picked it up, like it had been sitting in sunlight though the attic was cold and dark. As he rolled it between his fingers, the swirling colors seemed to form patterns, faces, places, memories that weren't his own. He saw a young woman in a blue dress, running through summer grass. He saw the same woman years later, her face twisted in fear as she held something in her cupped hands. He saw things that slithered and crawled at the edges of reality, waiting to be remembered. Tommy tried to put the marble down, but his fingers wouldn't release it. The memories kept coming, faster now. Grandmother Rose hadn't been the benign collector of trinkets and teller of tales he'd known. She'd been a keeper of something ancient, a guardian of doors that were never meant to be opened. And now, with her death, the contents of her memory box were looking for a new home. The first complete memory hit him like a thunderbolt. He was there, in his grandmother's body, barely 18 years old, standing in a moonlit clearing. The air smelled of wet earth and something else, something ancient and musty, like old books left too long in a damp basement. Before her stood a circle of standing stones, each one carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. In her hands, his hands, she held the marble. But it wasn't just a marble then. It pulsed with a blue-green light that matched the shimmer between the stones. An old woman stood beside her, her great-grandmother Eleanor, speaking words in a language that made his teeth ache. "The women in our family have always been the guardians," Eleanor was saying. "Since before the old world fell, since before the new gods came. We keep the memories safe. We keep the doors closed." The scene shifted. Now he was Rose at 25, cradling her newborn daughter, Tommy's mother, while the marble glowed on the nightstand. Shadows gathered in the corners of the hospital room, reaching with tendrils of darkness toward the baby. Rose's hand shot out, grabbed the marble, and the shadows retreated, hissing in voices that spoke of ancient hungers. Another shift. Rose at 40, standing in her kitchen while Tommy's mother, now a teenager, screamed at her. "You're crazy. All these rules, all these secrets. I want nothing to do with it." The marble sat between them on the kitchen table, its surface clouded and dark. "You don't understand," Rose pleaded. "It's our responsibility. The memories must be kept. If they get loose, I don't care. Keep your crazy traditions. I'm done." Tommy gasped as his own consciousness surfaced briefly. He was on his knees in the attic, sweat soaking his shirt despite the cold. The marble burned against his palm, eager to show him more. He tried again to drop it, but his fingers remained locked around its smooth surface. The memories dragged him under again. Now he saw what the marble truly was. Not just a repository of family memories, but a seal, a lock. Inside it swirled the collected memories of centuries, yes, but also the knowledge of things that existed in the spaces between spaces. Ancient beings that had once ruled the world, that had been pushed back by humans but never truly defeated. Beings that hungered for mankind's memories, their experiences, their very souls. The women in his family had been tasked with keeping these entities at bay. The marble was both key and locked to a door that must never be opened. Each guardian added her own memories to the marble, strengthening its power, while also taking on the burden of containing what lay behind that mystic door. But his mother had rejected the responsibility, and now Rose was gone. Tommy saw his grandmother's last days through her own eyes. She knew she was dying, knew she needed to pass on the guardianship, but to whom? Her own daughter had refused the calling, and Tommy, her only grandchild, was male. In all the centuries of guardians, there had never been a male keeper. Yet as her strength failed, Rose had made a choice. She placed the marble in the box and whispered the words that would allow it to choose its own next guardian, even if that meant breaking with tradition. She had hoped, in her final days, that perhaps Tommy had inherited enough of the family gift to take on the responsibility. Back in the attic, Tommy's vision cleared. The marble's glow had subsided to a gentle pulse, like a heartbeat. He could move his fingers now, could have put it down if he wanted to, but he didn't want to. He understood now why his mother had seemed so distant throughout his childhood, why she had refused to visit Grandma Rose except on major holidays. She had been running from this responsibility, this power. But Tommy wasn't running. The memories he had seen, the knowledge that now filled his mind, told him what he needed to do. The entities behind the door were stirring, sensing the weakness in the transition of power. Already, he could feel them testing the barriers, pushing against the walls of reality. He reached into the box and found what he had somehow known would be there. A small leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with his grandmother's cramped handwriting. Instructions, rituals, the collected wisdom of generations of guardians. Something scratched at the attic window. Tommy turned to see shadows gathering outside, darker than the falling night should allow. They had forms almost human, but stretched and twisted in ways that hurt his eyes. They sensed the marble's power, sensed his yet unsteady grasp of his new role. Clutching both marble and notebook, Tommy descended from the attic. He needed to prepare. The house, his grandmother's house, now his house, had been built on a place of power. The basement held a room his grandmother had always kept locked, a room his mother had warned him never to enter. Now he knew why. The entities would come for him soon, testing his strength, probing for weaknesses. He wasn't ready, wasn't trained, wasn't even supposed to be possible if centuries of tradition were to be believed. But he was what was available, and the marble had chosen him. In the kitchen, Tommy found his phone and dialed his mother's number. She needed to know what had happened, even if she wanted no part of it herself. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Mom," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "I found Grandma Rose's memory box. I know everything now. About the Guardians, about what we protect the world from. I know why you ran from it, but I want you to know that I'm not running. I'm going to do what needs to be done. If you want to help, if you want to talk, I'm here. I'm staying in Grandma's house. And Mom, I forgive you." He ended the call and looked down at the marble in his hand. Its swirling colors had settled into a pattern he was beginning to understand. A map of sorts, showing him where the barriers between worlds were thinnest, where he would need to focus his attention. The shadows outside were growing bolder. He could hear them whispering, promising him power, knowledge, freedom from the burden he'd inherited. All he had to do was open the door, just a crack, just enough to let them show him wonders beyond imagination. Tommy smiled grimly and began drawing the protective circles his grandmother's notebook described. He was the guardian now, tradition be damned, and he had work to do. In his hand, the marble pulsed with approval, adding his first memory as guardian to its swirling collection. The moment he chose to accept his inheritance, to stand against the darkness that hungry entities would unleash upon the world. It was a good memory, strong with purpose and determination, the kind of memory that could help seal the door for another generation. Outside, the night grew darker and the whispers grew louder. But inside the house, surrounded by the power of centuries of guardians, Tommy began to learn what it meant to be a keeper of memories, a guardian of doors, a protector of the world that most people thought they knew. He was no longer just Tommy, the ordinary 32-year-old who had come to clean out his grandmother's attic. He was something more now, something necessary. And as he opened his grandmother's notebook to its first page, he knew that his real story was just beginning. Amber knew something was wrong with the grandfather clock the moment she inherited it. The ancient timepiece had stood in her grandfather's study for as long as she could remember, its steady ticking a constant backdrop to her childhood visits. But now, watching the movers carefully navigate it through her front door, the ticking seemed different, like a heartbeat growing stronger. Your grandfather was very specific in his will, the lawyer had told her, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. The clock must go to you, and only you. He was quite insistent about that. The man had hesitated, then added, "He also left this envelope, to be opened only after the clock is placed in your home." Now, as the movers positioned the clock against her living room wall, Amber held the yellowed envelope in trembling fingers. The clock stood nearly 8 feet tall, crafted from dark mahogany that seemed to absorb the afternoon light. Its face was a masterwork of brass and silver, with symbols around the edges that didn't quite match any numeral she recognized. After the movers left, Amber sat cross-legged on her couch, studying the envelope. Her grandfather had been an odd man, a scholar of obscure histories and collector of strange artifacts. Her mother rarely spoke about him, except to say that he lived in a world of his own making. When Amber was young, she loved visiting his cramped Victorian house, listening to his stories about secret societies and hidden worlds that existed alongside our own. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, covered in her grandfather's precise handwriting. "My dearest Amber, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and the responsibility of the clock has passed to you. You were always my favorite grandchild. Not because you were the oldest or the smartest, but because you could see. You noticed the shadows that moved when they shouldn't, the moments when time seemed to slip sideways. The clock is not just a timepiece. It's a doorway, and more importantly, it's a lock. Every hour it strikes marks another seal holding back what lies between moments, between the ticks and the talks. There are rules you must follow. 1. Never let the clock stop. Wind it every Sunday before sunset. 2. When it strikes midnight, do not look at its face. 3. If you hear it strike 13, read the rest of this letter immediately. For now, that is all you need to know. Keep it wound. Keep it safe. And Amber, I'm sorry for the burden I've placed on you, but you were the only one strong enough to bear it. Your loving grandfather, Edmund. Amber looked up at the clock. It was 11:53 p.m. As she watched, the minute hand moved with a deliberate click, each movement feeling heavier than it should. The brass pendulum swung back and forth, its surface etched with the same strange symbols that surrounded the clock's face. At 11:59, she felt a shift in the air pressure of the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, and the temperature dropped several degrees. Amber remembered her grandfather's warning and turned away from the clock just as the first strike of midnight began. The chimes were deeper than she remembered, resonating in her chest like distant thunder. She counted them silently. 1, 2, 3. Each strike seemed to make the air thicker, harder to breathe. 4, 5, 6. The shadows were moving now. She was sure of it. 7, 8, 9. Something was whispering, just below the threshold of hearing. 10, 11, 12. Silence. Amber released the breath she'd been holding. She started to turn back toward the clock. 13. The final strike shook the house to its foundations. Amber's hands scrambled for the letter, unfolding it to the second page she hadn't noticed before. If you're reading this now, they've noticed you. The beings that live in the spaces between seconds, in the moments we miss when we blink. The clock keeps them out, but they're always looking for weaknesses, for ways to slip through. In my study, you'll find a red leather book titled Horologia Obscura. Get it now. You have until the next midnight to complete the binding ritual. Until then, do not leave the clock alone. They'll try to stop it. They'll try to distract you. Remember, what you see isn't real, but what you don't see can kill you. The key to my house is in the envelope. Amber appended the envelope, and a small brass key fell into her palm. Her grandfather's house was only 20 minutes away, but the thought of leaving the clock alone made her stomach clench. The ticking had changed again, becoming arrhythmic, like a mechanical heart struggling to maintain its rhythm. The shadows were definitely moving now, gathering in the corners like spilled ink. As she watched, they seemed to form shapes. Reaching hands, grasping fingers, faces that appeared and disappeared between one tick and the next. Her phone rang, making her jump. It was her mother. Amber? Thank God you answered. Listen to me, don't wind that clock. Your grandfather was not well at the end. He believed things. Impossible things. The clock is dangerous. I'm coming over. Amber ended the call. She remembered the summer she turned 12, when her mother had refused to let her visit grandfather Edmund anymore. He's feeding your imagination too much, she'd said. You need to live in the real world. But Amber had seen the fear in her mother's eyes, had noticed how she always avoided looking at the clock during family gatherings. The temperature dropped again. Amber's breath fogged in the air as she grabbed her car keys. The shadows were thicker now, and in their depths, she could see movement. Things crawling, slithering, reaching toward the clock with limbs that bent in too many places. She ran to her car. The drive to her grandfather's house was a blur of empty streets and flickering streetlights. Every time she looked in her rearview mirror, the shadows seemed to be following, flowing like dark water just at the edge of her headlights. Her grandfather's house stood dark and silent, its Victorian architecture a black silhouette against the star-filled sky. The brass key fitted perfectly in the lock. Inside, the house smelled of old books and the lingering scent of her grandfather's pipe tobacco. The study was exactly as she remembered. Walls lined with bookshelves, strange artifacts on every surface. A stuffed raven watched her from its perch atop a globe that showed continents that never existed. She found the red leather book exactly where her grandfather said it would be. Headlights swept across the windows. Her mother's car. Amber grabbed the book and ran, making it to her car just as her mother's voice called out behind her. She didn't stop, couldn't stop. The book seemed to pulse in her lap as she drove, its pages whispering against each other with each turn. Back home, the shadows had grown bolder. They hung in thick curtains around the clock, and in their depths, Amber could see faces, hundreds of them, all screaming silently, all reaching toward the clock's face with desperate, grasping hands. She opened the book with trembling fingers. Its pages were filled with diagrams, incantations, and warnings. She found the binding ritual her grandfather had mentioned, its instructions written in both Latin and English. The clock between worlds requires a guardian, a soul to stand between moments and maintain the barrier. The current guardian's blood must be willingly given, mixed with that of the new guardian, and applied to the clock's face at the stroke of midnight. Amber's eyes went to the clock. 11:45 p.m. The shadows were pressing closer, and in their depths, she could see things moving. Things with too many eyes, too many limbs, things that existed in geometries that hurt her mind to look at. Her phone rang again. Her mother. This time, she answered. Amber, please. Her mother's voice was desperate. Don't do what he asked. You don't understand what it means, what it will cost you. I watched it destroy him, watched it take everything he was. That's why I ran. That's why I kept you away. Please, baby, please don't. You knew, Amber whispered. You knew about all of this. I was supposed to be the next guardian, but I couldn't. I wasn't strong enough. Your grandfather? He took my place, but it wasn't meant for him. The clock needs a female guardian from the bloodline. That's why. Her mother's voice broke. That's why he chose you. Because I failed. 11:50 p.m. The shadows were almost solid now, pressing against the clock like a tide of darkness. Amber could hear them whispering, promising her things, threatening her with others. I'm sorry, Mom, Amber said, but I can see them. I always could. And if I don't do this, they'll get through. She ended the call and opened the book to the ritual page. The clock's ticking grew louder, more insistent. The shadows pressed closer, and in their depths, she could see her grandfather's face, younger than she'd ever known him, nodding in approval. 11:59 p.m. Amber pricked her finger with the silver pin included in the book's binding. A drop of blood welled up, dark in the shadowed room. The clock began to strike midnight. 1. She touched her bleeding finger to the clock's face. 2. The shadows surged forward. 3. Her mother burst through the front door. 4. The shadows touched her skin, cold as death. 5. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. You were always the one who could see. 6. The room filled with impossible colors. 7. Her mother screamed. 8. Amber felt something ancient and powerful stir within the clock. 9. The shadows tried to pull her away. 10. She pressed her hand flat against the clock's face. 11. Reality bent around her. 12. Everything stopped. When Amber opened her eyes, the shadows were gone. The clock ticked steadily, its rhythm now matching her heartbeat exactly. Her mother stood frozen in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. It's done, Amber said, and her voice seemed to echo between moments. She could feel the clock now, feel the weight of its purpose, feel the things that pressed against the barriers between seconds, testing, searching, hungry, and she could feel her own power holding them back, keeping the doors between moments firmly closed. She looked at her mother with eyes that could now see the truth of things, the ghostly imprint of what might have been, had she taken up the guardian's mantle all those years ago. I understand now, Amber said, why you ran, but I won't. This is what I was meant for. The clock ticked on, marking time not just in this world, but in all the worlds that existed in the spaces between moments. Amber settled into her new role, feeling the power of generations of guardians flowing through her blood. She was no longer just Amber. She was the keeper of moments, the guardian of time, the protector of reality's fragile barriers. And in the depths of the clock, in the space between tick and tock, the ancient entities raged and howled, knowing they had lost their chance, at least until the next guardian would be needed. But that was a worry for another time. Another moment, another tick of the eternal clock. For now, Amber stood watch, as her grandfather had before her, as her grandmother had before him, as countless guardians had done since the first clock was built to hold back the chaos between moments. The ticking of the clock was steady, strong, and sure, and somewhere, in the spaces between seconds, her grandfather smiled. Sarah hadn't heard the knocking in days. After 2 weeks of constant, rhythmic tapping from within her walls, the silence felt wrong somehow, more threatening than the noise had ever been. It started the night she moved into the Victorian townhouse, a property she'd managed to snag well below market value in one of Boston's most desirable neighborhoods. The real estate agent had been suspiciously eager to close, rushing through paperwork with trembling hands. Sarah hadn't questioned it. Finding an affordable place in Beacon Hill was like winning the lottery. The first knock came as she unpacked her bedroom. 3 sharp raps, evenly spaced, emanating from somewhere inside the wall behind her antique dresser. She froze, box cutter hovering over a sealed moving carton. The sound repeated, tap, tap, tap. Must be the pipes, she muttered, though the hollow, wooden quality of the sound suggested otherwise. Old houses made noise, that's what everyone said. She forced herself to continue unpacking, ignoring the steady percussion that continued well past midnight. But the knocking didn't stop. It followed her from room to room, always maintaining the same measured tempo, always seeming to originate from just behind the wallpaper. She tried sleeping with music playing, then with industrial-grade earplugs. Nothing could fully mask that persistent tapping. After the first week, Sarah called a plumber. He found nothing wrong with the pipes, though he did comment on the unusual thickness of the walls. "Never seen anything quite like it," he said, rapping his knuckles against the plaster, almost like there's a space between the inner and outer walls. Weird construction choice. The knocking grew louder after he left. She contacted the previous owners next, but her real estate agent informed her that the house had been empty for nearly a decade, tied up in some complicated estate dispute. The last actual residents had been the Aldrich family, elderly siblings who'd lived there together until their mysterious disappearance in 1987. By the second week, Sarah started knocking back. It began as an act of frustration. She slammed her fist against the wall one night, screaming for the noise to stop. To her shock, the tapping ceased immediately. For 30 glorious seconds, silence reigned. Then, tap, tap, tap. She knocked again, mimicking the rhythm. The unseen presence replied with the same pattern. A call and response, like some twisted version of Marco Polo. That's when the patterns began to change. The simple 3-beat rhythm evolved into more complex sequences. Sarah found herself drawn into these exchanges, spending hours trading increasingly elaborate knock patterns with whatever lurked within her walls. She told herself it was just a game, a way to maintain her sanity until she could figure out what was really going on. But then she started noticing other changes. The wallpaper began to bubble and peel in places, revealing glimpses of what looked like old newspapers stuffed between the walls. The articles she managed to read all dated from 1987, many featuring headlines about the missing Aldrich siblings. The knocking grew more insistent, almost desperate. Sometimes Sarah thought she could hear something else beneath the tapping, a muffled sound, like someone trying to speak through layers of paper and plaster. That's when she found the diary. It was tucked away in the back of a kitchen cabinet, its pages yellow with age. The cover bore the name Eleanor Aldrich in faded script. Sarah read it by candlelight that night, as the knocking provided a steady backbeat to the horrifying story that unfolded. Eleanor wrote of her younger brother Thomas's growing paranoia, his conviction that they were watching him through the walls. He began filling the spaces between the walls with newspaper, claiming it would keep them out, but his delusions only worsened. The final entry, dated 3 days before the siblings' disappearance, contained a chilling confession. Thomas says the only way to truly seal the house is from within. He's removed sections of the plaster in every room, creating spaces large enough for a person to slip inside. He says we'll be safe there, protected from their eyes. I fear what he might do if I refuse. The knocking in my head won't stop. Sarah slammed the diary shut, her hands shaking. The tapping from within the walls had ceased again, leaving that terrible, anticipatory silence. That was 3 days ago. Now, sitting in her kitchen at 3 a.m., Sarah traced her fingers along a section of wallpaper that had begun to separate from the wall, revealing a dark gap behind it. The opening looked just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The silence pressed against her eardrums like cotton wool. She found herself missing the knocking. At least that had been something tangible, something she could respond to. This silence felt like a held breath, an invitation. Sarah gripped the loose wallpaper, her heart pounding. The gap beckoned. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, she imagined she could hear the rustle of old newspapers, and perhaps, was that breathing? A new sound broke the silence. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, it came from behind her. Sarah whirled around. The kitchen was empty, but the knocking continued, now coming from multiple directions at once. The walls seemed to pulse with it, decades of layered newspapers shifting and whispering. Tap, tap, tap. She pressed her back against the wall, trying to track the sound's source. It was impossible. The knocking seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, growing louder with each repetition. Tap, tap, tap. The gap in the wallpaper widened slightly, old paper crackling like dead leaves. Sarah caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness beyond. A pale flash, like skin. Tap, tap, tap. A hand thrust through the gap, yellowed newspaper clinging to withered fingers. Sarah screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the thunderous knocking that now filled the house. More hands emerged from other gaps in the wallpaper. Dozens of them, reaching, grasping. The hands belonged to people, or what had once been people. Their bodies were paper-thin, compressed by decades spent between the walls, their skin the same yellowed shade as the ancient newspapers that had become fused with their flesh. Their faces were masked by pages of newsprint, headlines from 1987 still legible across their foreheads. Sarah tried to run, but the hands caught her, their touch dry and rustling. They pulled her toward the gap in the wall, which had widened into a dark maw. She caught one final glimpse of her kitchen before they dragged her into the space between the walls. A space that should have been inches wide, but somehow contained an impossible maze of narrow corridors, all lined with yellowing newspaper and filled with shuffling, paper-thin figures. The last thing she saw was a face emerging from the layers of newsprint. An elderly woman's visage, her features distorted by the headlines pressed into her skin. "Welcome home," Eleanor Aldrich whispered, her voice crackling like old paper. "We've been waiting for someone to knock back." The gap in the wallpaper sealed itself, leaving only a slight bulge to mark where Sarah had disappeared. The house fell silent once more, waiting for its next resident. For a few days, missing person posters appeared around Beacon Hill, bearing Sarah's photo and the address of the Victorian townhouse. But like the similar posters from 1987, they eventually faded and peeled away, joining the layers of paper that filled the spaces between the walls. The real estate agent listed the property again, marking down the price even further. The house would wait, collecting dust and silence, until someone new came along. Someone who wouldn't be able to resist answering that first, simple knock. Tap, tap, tap. That was the last of today's 3 haunting tales. If you want to discover more mysterious stories like these, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss our upcoming stories about mysterious guardians, cursed objects, and family secrets that should never see the light of day. Let me know in the comments which of the 3 stories impacted you the most and why. Next week we'll be back with new stories that will keep you glued to your screen. See you in the next video.